Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep beneath ancient churches, down stone steps slick with centuries of candle soot, into the echoing, shadowed chambers of medieval Europe where monks once stacked skulls and femurs like firewood, decorating their sanctuaries with the dead. You might imagine a quiet monastery filled with prayer and peace, but these places were often full of death, not just metaphorically, but physically. In many parts of Europe, the bones of the departed didn't stay buried long. Space was tight, and graveyards were full, so monks exhumed the bones, sorted them by type, and arranged them in macabre patterns across chapels and crypts. It's beautiful, it's reverent, it's deeply unsettling, and if you're thinking, I could totally handle that, well, you probably wouldn't survive your first month living among these skull-studded sanctuaries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tradition of collecting bones didn't start in some dark corner of Europe. It was born from necessity, and later, theology. Picture this. It's the 12th century in a bustling medieval town, and the graveyards are already full. People are dying faster than plots can be dug. The church owned the burial grounds, and as time passed, even they were running out of space. But in the Christian world, you couldn't just cremate people. That would have been seen as denying the resurrection of the body. So what do? You wait. After a body has decomposed, maybe after 7 or 15 years, depending on climate and soil, you dig it up. You remove the bones. You keep them, because they're still sacred. And you stack them, often in crypts or charnel houses near the church, to make room for new burials. And slowly, these piles became artistic expressions. They became the word ossuary comes from the Latin ossuarium, meaning a container or room for bones. At first, these were plain storage places, but medieval monks, many trained in geometry, philosophy, and liturgical symbolism, began to arrange the bones in patterns, roses made of femurs, crosses from tibi, arches of skulls. They turned death into decoration, not out of morbidity, but devotion. Let's take the Sedlic ossuary in the Czech Republic. In the 13th century, the abbot of the monastery there brought back a handful of dirt from Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified, and scattered it over the local cemetery. That made it holy ground. Word spread. People from all over wanted to be buried there. And by the time the Black Death hit in the mid-1300s, tens of thousands had already been laid to rest. The monks began digging up the older graves to make room. They stored the bones in a crypt beneath the chapel. But in the 16th century, a blind monk was tasked with organizing them. He didn't just stack them, he arranged them into symmetrical pyramids and decorative. And then, in the 1800s, a local woodcarver was commissioned to do something more grand. He used the bones of an estimated 40,000 people to create chandeliers, coats of arms, and garlands. When you visit the Sedlic ossuary today, you see a chandelier made from every single bone in the human body. Skulls line the walls in geometric patterns. Crossbones form decorative trim. It feels reverent, like a reminder of mortality, not a horror show. But you can't help wondering, who were these people? Did they know they'd become part of a monk's artistic vision after death? The monks didn't see bones as gruesome. To them, bones were what's left after the trials of earthly life. What remains for resurrection. They weren't throwing away the bodies. They were honoring them. Arranging bones into shapes and symbols was a form of devotion, a kind of sacred geometry. And yet, it wasn't only devotion. Sometimes, it was also theater. The Capuchin crypt in Rome, for instance, goes even further. Its 6 chapels are decorated entirely in human remains, tens of thousands of Capuchin friars' bones. Each chapel is themed. You've got the crypt of the skulls, the crypt of the crypt of the leg bones, and over one doorway reads this inscription: "What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be." It's not subtle. These monks wanted you to remember death, memento mori. In an age of plagues, short lifespans, and constant reminders of mortality, the ossuary wasn't just a storage problem, it was a spiritual lesson, carved in calcium. You might imagine walking into one of these crypts and finding silence, but you'd probably hear the soft rustle of robes, the scraping of broom bristles, and the echoing chant of vespers from above. Monks still lived and worked above these crypts. They cleaned them, prayed over them, Sometimes they even added new bones to the displays, carefully removing a single skull from a stack to replace it with a recently disinterred friar's. How did that feel to handle the skull of a man who once shared your chapel, your choir, your meals? These monks believed they were doing sacred work, and in a strange way, they were. The ossuaries became symbols of humility. They reminded both monk and visitor that all glory is fleeting, all flesh is temporary, and only the soul endures. It wasn't about fear, it was about peace in the face of certainty. Still, not everyone appreciated these spaces. Some saw them as grotesque, others as unsettling. Visitors in later centuries would recoil, yet the monks carried on, decade after decade, adding bone to bone in quiet reverence. But one has to wonder, did the monks ever feel uneasy themselves? Was there a line between devotion and the macabre? The monks who lived above the ossuaries did not think of themselves as surrounded by the dead. In their worldview, death was not an end, but a transition and essential step in the spiritual journey. The skeletal remains arranged in arches, chandeliers, and pyramids were not morbid decorations. They were silent companions in prayer. Yet to modern minds, it's nearly impossible to imagine waking each morning, putting on your habit, and going to sweep a corridor lined with the femurs of thousands. Still, this was daily life for many monastic orders in medieval Europe. The monastic rhythm or itlabora, prayer and work, continued undisturbed, even in the presence of death. A Capuchin friar in the 17th century might have risen before dawn, joined the communal chant of matins, and then walked downstairs with a broom in one hand and a lantern in the other. The flickering glow would have lit up hollow sockets and rows of ribs stacked like bundles of firewood. But to the monk, these were reminders, not ghosts. Many ossuaries were not merely crypts, they were integrated into chapels or adjoining hallways. The Sedlic ossuary, the Brno ossuary, the Paris catacombs, and the Évora chapel in Portugal all serve as examples of how bones weren't hidden, but displayed with careful intent. The Évora chapel even bears an inscription similar to Rome's Capuchin crypt. "We bones that are here." The theological underpinning of this practice was rooted in the medieval obsession with memento mori, Latin for remember that you must die. This wasn't just spiritual philosophy, it was practical. The monks lived in times of unpredictable mortality. Plagues swept through Europe in waves. Famine struck entire regions. A minor injury could turn septic and kill you within days. Death was always nearby, so it made sense to look it in the face, literally. By incorporating human remains into the architecture of their worship spaces, monks created a kind of continuity. The dead were not gone. They were still part of the community. Their bodies may have but their spiritual presence remained manifested through the bones carefully arranged into crosses, rosettes, and ornamental patterns that stared down at each new generation of brothers. Monks also saw the bones as teaching tools. Visitors, both pilgrims and the curious wealthy, were allowed into the chapels, where they would encounter walls of skulls and the faint, earthy scent of long-decayed flesh. These sites were meant to stir something deeper than fear, humility. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, nothing leveled a king and a peasant like a stack of skulls arranged neatly by the choir altar. There are written accounts of monks giving informal lectures to visitors, pointing out certain arrangements and explaining their meaning. A row of jawless skulls might symbolize the silence of death. A cross of vertebrae suggested the weight of the spiritual path. No bone was placed randomly. Every rib, pelvis, and phalanx had a purpose, like an alphabet in a language only the devout could read. And yet, the monks still lived above all of this. They ate their meals in refectories nearby. They washed in stone basins down the hall. Some even wrote music or illuminated manuscripts within earshot of these bone-filled chapels. Could they ever tune it out completely? Or did the presence of the dead serve as a constant, low hum in their thoughts? In one preserved letter from a Benedictine monk in the he describes polishing a skull before placing it in a niche, then praying over it. He wrote, "I do not know his name, but I know he sought the same peace I now seek. I hope he has found it. I hope I shall join him when it is my time." The tone is not fearful. It's gentle, personal. There were rules. Not just anyone could be interred in an os. Often, the bones belonged to members of the monastic order itself, friars, who had lived out their vows in poverty and prayer. In larger cities, bones from local citizens might be added, especially in times of plague. But always, there was a process. Bodies were buried first, left to decompose naturally, and then exhumed after a set period, sometimes with ceremonies marking their transition to the bone crypt. During the Black Death, that rhythm was broken. Death came faster than monks could dig. Entire cemeteries were overwhelmed. In some cases, monks buried victims in mass graves. Years later, when they exhumed the remains, the sheer volume of bones changed the aesthetic of ossuaries forever. Decoration became density. What had once been a spiritual meditation space became a necessity, a compact, layered archive of the dead. The Capuchins in Rome went a step further. They built elaborate scenes from bones, not just patterns, but narrative art. A skeleton in a monk's robe holding a winged figure made entirely from scapulae and finger bones. They were theatrical, even haunting, but the intent remained the same: to remind the living that this, too, was their destiny. And yet, not every monk was at peace. Whispers from the margins of historical records speak of friars who grew uneasy. A fragment from a late 16th century monastic chronicle in southern France mentions a brother who began having dreams, visions of bone piles shifting, of skulls speaking in tongues. Another manuscript refers to a novice who fled the order after being tasked with organizing the ossuary vault. His writings were burned, deemed heretical, but not before one quote was preserved: "The dead should not be real. They dream in their dust." These are outliers, of course. Most monks saw the bone chapels as extensions of their faith, but the practice was not without internal debate. As the Renaissance bloomed and ideas about science and anatomy evolved, some monks began questioning whether this was piety or spectacle. Was it honoring the dead, or imprisoning them in ornament? And as pilgrims began treating ossuaries like curiosities rather than sanctuaries, the tension deepened. Could reverence survive spectacle? Could death still teach peace when it was lit by candlelight and photographed by tourists? By the time the Enlightenment dawned across Europe, the relationship between death and the living world had begun to shift. Scientific inquiry began to displace religious symbolism. The body, once treated as a sacred vessel awaiting resurrection, was now studied as a system of parts: blood, nerve, tendon, and bone. The monks in ossuary chapels were still stacking femurs, but outside their stone walls, medicine, anatomy, and rationalism were transforming the perception of death. Still, many ossuaries continued to grow. The Capuchin crypt in Rome added bones well into the 19th century. At Sedlec, the chandelier of bones and the Schwarzenberg coat of arms constructed from scapulae and skulls remained untouched, their forms casting long, intricate shadows across the chapel walls. But something was changing. More and more, visitors arrived not in pilgrimage but in curiosity. By the Victorian era, ossuaries had become travel destinations. Guidebooks included them as eerie travelogues from the time, are filled with descriptions written in tones that oscillate between fascination and revulsion. One English traveler wrote of the Sedlec ossuary in 1849, "A place more grotesque in devotion I cannot imagine, and yet it carries with it an inexplicable serenity. I left feeling neither comforted nor disturbed, but strangely seen." It was during this period that the tension reached its peak. The monks themselves faced new questions. Was the bone chapel still a sacred space, or was it becoming a spectacle for outsiders? Some tried to reassert the spiritual purpose of the displays, hosting prayer services in the ossuaries, hanging crosses and scriptures among the bones. Others quietly removed particularly ornate arrangements, uncomfortable with the theatrical flair that earlier monks had embraced. And yet, the bones remained. Because how could they not? They were the story. The ossuaries stood as architectural records of death, untouched by fire or war. The skulls that lined the walls weren't just decorations. They were historical data. Each cranium spoke to a diet, a disease, a genetic line. Some bore marks of trepanation or battle trauma. Some had perfect, symmetrical teeth, others none at all. If you looked closely enough, you could read Europe's past in the curvature of its dead. But monks weren't anthropologists. They were keepers of souls. And for most of them, the bones were not scientific specimens. They were reminders of impermanence and of promise. In Catholic theology, the resurrection of the body remained central. To keep the bones safe and visible was to remain vigilant for that eventual, glorious reawakening. Even into the 20th century, new ossuaries were built, most notably in places devastated by war. After World War I, the ossuary at Douaumont in France was erected to house the remains of over 130,000 unknown soldiers. It was not decorative, but somber. The style was stark. The bones were not visible, but the symbolism remained. Here, too, was the Bone-Ass Testament, back in the religious ossuaries. However, fewer new bones were added. In many parts of Europe, burial practices had changed. Cremation, once taboo, gained acceptance. Urban cemeteries expanded, and so the ossuaries became frozen in time, their last editions now centuries behind. But the monks, who remained fewer and fewer with each passing decade, still preyed among the bones. Today, if you were to visit the Capuchin crypt in Rome, you'd find the bones still there, the signs still in place. But the monks, only a few remain. The chapels are mostly silent. Visitors walk in with quiet reverence, some snapping photos on their phones, others just standing in stillness. One exhibit plaque, recently added, reads, "These remains remind us not only of mortality, but of devotion. Each bone once carried a soul devoted to humility, silence, and service." It's a powerful statement, but perhaps not enough to bridge the gap between the world that created these places and the world that now visits them. Because the truth is, the monks who stacked bones weren't trying to shock us. They were trying to prepare themselves for death, for rebirth, for eternity. They weren't interested in haunting. They were focused on hope. And yet, even with that knowledge, it's hard not to feel a chill walking through those crypts. The quiet is dense. The air seems older than the stones. You might catch the faint scent of candle wax clinging to the damp. And then you turn a corner and see a wall of skulls, each one still whispering its unspoken story. You begin to wonder, who were these people? What were their names? Did they imagine, as they died centuries ago, that their bones would become bricks in a chapel wall? Or, perhaps, the better question is, what would they think of you standing there, breathing, blinking, alive? This is the quiet horror and quiet beauty of the ossuaries. They confront us not with violence or fear, but with calm, unrelenting mortality. They ask a single, difficult question. When your body is gone, what will remain of you? Long before modern cemeteries lined with neat rows of headstones, death in medieval London was chaotic, crowded, and unsanitary. Beneath cobbled lanes and forgotten alleyways, lie mass graves, plague pits dug in desperation as the city gasped beneath waves of epidemic. Thousands were buried hurriedly, without rites or markers, the remains now lying beneath parks, schools, and homes. And most people walk right over them, never knowing what lies beneath. During the 14th century, the Black Death arrived in England with terrifying speed. It likely came by ship, creeping up the Thames into the city of London around 1348. By the time it was over, nearly half the city's population was dead. There weren't enough grave diggers. Cemeteries were overwhelmed. Churches ran out of burial plots. So, city officials authorized the digging of vast plague pits upon trenches where the dead could be dumped by the dozens. This wasn't done out of disrespect. There was simply no other option. Corpses piled up in the streets. Some were dumped in carts by surviving relatives. Others were left at night on church steps, with handwritten notes or a piece of cloth tucked into their clothes, identifying their name. It was a dark, messy time, and the city's priests and friars struggled to keep up with the burials. These plague pits, some of them 50 feet long or more, were often dug in fields just outside the city walls. Clockenwell, East Smithfield, Tothill Fields. Today, these areas are covered by modern buildings, pavements, and playgrounds. But from time to time, during construction work or archaeological surveys, they reappear. In 1986, while building an extension to the Royal Mint, workers uncovered a massive burial site in East Smithfield. It turned out to be one of the largest Black Death plague pits in the country. Archaeologists recovered over 760 women, children all, buried in layers, side by side, some still clutching rosary beads or wearing the remnants of linen shrouds. Many of their skulls bore signs of poor nutrition, chronic infection, or blunt force trauma. Some were twisted in death, likely buried hastily and without ceremony. What struck the researchers most was the care taken despite the circumstances. Although the burials were rapid and without individual markers, the dead were not tossed randomly. They were laid out in rows, often facing the same direction, and sometimes separated by thin layers of soil. It spoke to an urgency balanced with compassion. But as the centuries passed, the knowledge of these sites faded. The pits were covered over, forgotten, and eventually built upon. London grew atop the graves, and then, during the Great Plague of 1665, another wave of death, though not as severe as the Black Death, the process repeated itself. Once again, plague pits were dug. Parish records from the time mention entire families being buried in a single night. Diarist Samuel Pepys wrote in horror of carts rumbling through the streets at night, piled high with bodies and accompanied by men crying, "Bring out your dead." Most of the time, These pits weren't marked on any permanent maps. This was partly due to shame. Londoners did not like being reminded of the city's darkest days. But it was also practical. The pits were considered temporary solutions. The assumption was that, eventually, these areas would be reburied, built over, or forgotten. And they were. Until someone starts digging. Modern discoveries of plague pits come with a strange mixture of reverence and urgency. When construction crews unearth skeletal remains, they must immediately halt work. Archaeologists are brought in. Biohazard teams sometimes follow just in case. And then, slowly, the long dead rise again. Not with horror, but with quiet dignity. Their bones are catalogued, studied, and sometimes reinterred in formal cemeteries. But they never return to silence completely. Because each plague pit tells a story not just of death, but of how Londoners endured how the city, choking on disease and panic, found ways to survive. Not always heroically, not always kindly, but persistently. You might wonder, why weren't all these bones moved once the city modernized? Why didn't Victorian officials relocate the plague dead to formal cemeteries? The answer is partly superstition. Many believed it was bad luck to disturb plague pit. There were rumors passed down in whispers that doing so could reawaken disease. Even today, those who uncover such graves speak quietly about the heavy feeling of being near so many dead. Some sites are still left untouched, buried under parks or green spaces, a kind of invisible cemetery no one officially acknowledges. But it's also about memory. These pits, though unmarked, became part of the city's fabric. People built homes nearby. Children played on the grass above them, and life went on. Yet beneath the footsteps of joggers in Finsbury, or beneath the benches in Charterhouse Square, lie the silent witnesses of London's most terrifying seasons. Their bones rest in layers, folded into the soil, unvisited and unnamed. But they are still there, and that raises an unsettling thought. How many forgotten plague pits lie beneath modern cities undiscovered? It is one thing to know plague pits exist in the abstractive, except that they lie beneath cities like London as silent testaments to forgotten tragedies. But it's something else entirely when they rise again, intruding on the modern world. And in London, they do. Not with ghost stories or poltergeist activity, but with hard, physical presence. Bones in walls, skulls in gardens, femurs tucked beneath basement tiles. One of the most notable during excavation work for the Crossrail project, London's massive underground train network. In Charterhouse Square, a team of workers digging deep beneath the historic site struck something unexpected. Tightly packed human remains. At first glance, it looked like a small burial ground, but as archaeologists peeled back the layers, it became clear this was a plague pit. And not just any pit, but one of the Black Death's earliest and densest burial sites in the city. Dozens of skeletons were found buried, shoulder to shoulder, carefully layered, many showing no signs of trauma. Bioarchaeologists studying the remains were able to identify traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death, in dental pulp. The teeth, long protected in the mouths of the dead, had become tiny time capsules, preserving microscopic evidence of a pandemic that once reduced the city's population by half. What surprised researchers most was how little disturbance had occurred to the pit over centuries. The bones were largely undisturbed, suggesting the site had remained untouched since the 14th century. Above it, a school had operated for years. Children played on top of it daily, and no one ever knew. But that wasn't an isolated case. In 2006, a man doing renovations on his Georgian townhouse in Spitalfields unearthed several human bones while reflooring his cellar. He thought at first they were leftovers from an old butcher's shop, but when the remains kept coming and included children's skulls, he alerted local authorities. Archaeologists were called in and determined that his house sat atop a section of an unrecorded 17th century plague pit, hastily filled during the 1665 outbreak. Instances like these happen more often than one might expect. Sometimes it's during construction. Other times, it's simply erosion or shifting ground that brings the past to the surface. There have been cases where tree roots growing through parks have lifted femurs to the grass, or where foundation work in older neighborhoods has revealed piles of ribs and pelvises arranged in rough rows. London's soil is deep, but not bottomless, and each time bones emerge, they present a strange challenge. By law, construction must halt. The remains must be treated with dignity, studied if appropriate, and then But what happens to the projects paused for weeks or months while these unintentional exhumations occur? Developers grumble. But historians and public health scholars quietly rejoice, because every plague pit offers a chance to learn. Some have helped map how the plague spread across London. By studying DNA in teeth, pesties evolved between the 14th and 17th centuries. Others have illuminated how poor diet, child mortality, and social status played into survival rates. Bones speak in ways documents can't. They carry disease markers, stress fractures, and evidence of how people lived and along the margins of catastrophe. But even as these scientific benefits accumulate, the emotional weight remains. Imagine being a worker on a site digging through centuries of rock and clay only to uncover a fragile skull, tilted slightly to one side, the jaw half open, in a silent pose. Imagine finding dozens more, layered like sediment, each with a story you'll never fully know. Not every worker can handle it. Some leave the job. Others develop an odd attachment to the sites, visiting the crypts or memorials where the bones are later In interviews, several archaeologists speak of a lingering heaviness around plague pits. Not spiritual, exactly not ghosts or curses, but a silent chorus of human suffering condensed into one small corner of earth. And still, the digging continues. London grows, buildings rise, and beneath them, the pits remain. Few cities have layered themselves so densely with history. Beneath medieval streets lie Roman ruins, Saxon coins, Tudor wells, and each time the past emerges, it poses the same haunting question. What do we owe the dead? Is it enough to study their bones, to photograph them, and lay them back to rest? Or should something more be done? Today, some plague pit sites have been quietly marked with memorial stones or plaques. Others remain anonymous, either out of uncertainty or bureaucratic oversight. In places like East Smithfield and Charterhouse Square, small signs acknowledge the mass graves. But elsewhere, you might be dining at a cafe, walking your dog, or commuting to work, never knowing that a few meters beneath your feet lies a trench filled with the forgotten victims of history's most infamous disease. The silence of plague pits is deceptive. They seem gone, covered, forgotten, but the bones are there, and the earth, from time to time, remembers. And what happens when the ground decides to speak again? By the 21st century, most Londoners had forgotten about the plague pits entirely until the bones started coming back. Not just in archaeological digs or construction sites, but in something more subtle. Local stories, whispered folklore, and a quiet sense that something still lingered beneath the surface. In neighborhoods like Clerkenwell, Holborn, and Stepney Green, tales began to re-emerge. People spoke of cold spots in their basements, tools going missing near dig sites, or unsettling dreams after moving into new flats, built on reclaimed land. None of these stories were sensational. They rarely made the news, but they circulated through local history groups and neighborhood pubs, often told with a nervous chuckle and a glance over the shoulder. Take, for instance, the legend of the Grey Woman of Moorfields, a figure said to appear on foggy evenings near the site of an old burial ground, drifting silently between the trees of a modern park. No one remembers when the story began, only that she's always described the same way. Barefoot, dressed in 17th century clothing, and clutching something in her arms that no one's ever clearly seen. Or the strange story of a primary school where during a renovation in the late 1990s, construction workers unearthed several child-sized skeletons while expanding a basement classroom. The remains were carefully removed and reinterred elsewhere, but teachers later reported that 4 months afterward, the room remained off. Lights flickered. Cold drafts slipped under doors on windless days. Children refused to enter unless accompanied. Eventually, the space was converted into storage. Coincidence? Very likely. But such stories persist not because they're provable, but because they speak to something deeper. The unease that arises when the past is buried poorly, and the dead lie unnamed. Plague pits, by their nature, violate our usual relationship with the dead. There are no names, no dates of birth, no tokens of love or photographs tucked into stone niches. Just a mass of anonymous suffering stacked, layered, and covered over by convenience and necessity. And over time, that anonymity unsettles people. Modern memorials try to bridge the gap. At the East Smithfield site, a simple plaque now reads, "Here lie the remains of those taken by the Great Pestilence. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget the price of our survival." It's a noble gesture. But still, the majority of plague pits remain unmarked. And so the legacy of these forgotten dead lives on, not just in bones or data, but in the psychological and cultural fabric of the city. In London's architecture, there are places where buildings were planned to avoid certain patches of land, not because of zoning but because it just didn't feel right. Construction supervisors who worked on sites that uncovered plague graves speak of an odd heaviness in the team, of work slowing, tempers rising, accidents happening without clear cause, no curses, no ghosts, just the pressure of memory. Perhaps anthropologists sometimes describe this phenomenon as deep time haunting. It's not supernatural in the usual sense. It's the quiet persistence of history in places that have tried to forget. When trauma is buried without witness, without ritual, it can surface not as a ghost, but as a feeling, a place where the ground itself seems to murmur. And maybe that's what plague pits are. Not haunted graveyards, not evil places, but pressure points in the memory of a city. Open wounds, covered too quickly. Because the truth is, the people buried in these pits were no different from us. They lived in cities, laughed with neighbors, worried over food and money and children. And then, one day, disease came. They were sick. Then they were gone, buried fast, forgotten faster. Yet they built the cities we now walk through. Their bones lie beneath our foundations, their fears woven into our folklore. They did not die to teach us a lesson, but perhaps there's something to learn from them all the same. In an age of mass death and public health crises, the plague pits of London serve not just as relics but warnings. They remind us that society doesn't always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it simply gasps and stumbles, burdened by the weight of its own death, and finds a way imperfect and hurried to carry on. The trenches are dug. The earth is filled. The city moves forward. But memory, that lingers. You may never feel it. Walking through a leafy park in the city, you may never notice the slight rise in the ground, or the way flowers refuse to grow in certain spots. You may never think to wonder what lies beneath the curb where you wait for your bus. But one day, a shovel will hit bone again, and the silence will speak. And when it does, will we be ready to listen this time? Nestled deep in the Austrian Alps, among sweeping green valleys, and the mirror-like surface of Lake Holstadt, lies a picture-perfect town where time seems suspended. Wooden houses cling to the steep mountain face, smoke curls from chimneys, and tourists shuffle quietly along cobblestone paths. But beneath the quaint charm lies something unexpected, a chapel filled with painted human skulls, arranged in neat rows, staring calmly from the shelves of a bone house known as the Bine House. It's easy to miss. Tucked behind the 12th century Catholic parish church of Alps, the Bine House looks like little more than a stone-out building, modest, even peaceful. But step inside, and you're met with shelves upon shelves of crania, each carefully labeled with names and death dates, many adorned with wreaths, floral motifs, and delicate painted crosses. In total, over 600 skulls rest here, stacked among other bones, each one a testament to the town's unique relationship with the dead. Unlike the grand ossuaries of Paris or Rome, Hallstatt's bone house wasn't born of cataclysm. It was born of constraint. The village, ancient and small, has always had limited space, carved into the mountainside with little flat land to spare. The local cemetery filled up quickly, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, long before cremation was acceptable in Catholic practice, exhumation became a necessity. After about 10 to 15 years in the ground, bodies were carefully exhumed, especially if the deceased had no surviving family to maintain the grave. The bones were cleaned, the skulls bleached in sunlight, and then, in an act both respectful and oddly artistic, they were painted with ivy, oak, leaves, and roses. Some are bright, others faded, their pigments worn by time and alpine air. Each skull bears a name, sometimes a birth year, sometimes a death date. Some feature gentle phrases in German like Ruhe in Frieden. This wasn't done to shock. In fact, it was considered an honor. Having your skull painted and placed in the Bine House meant your memory would live and not lost beneath the earth, but seen, preserved, remembered. For centuries, Hallstatt villagers would visit the Bine House to reflect, to pray, and to feel close to ancestors whose names they could read and faces they could imagine. The earliest skulls in the collection date to the early 1600s. But the tradition didn't end there. In fact, it continued well into the 20th century. One of the most recent additions is a woman who died in 1983. Her last wish was to join her relatives in the Bine. Her skull, painted and inscribed, now rests among them. The painting itself followed certain conventions. Men's skulls were typically decorated with oak leaf symbols of strength and longevity. Women's often bore floral garlands, reflecting beauty and gentleness. Occasionally, skulls of children appear, marked more simply, sometimes with a small cross or no decoration at all. What makes this tradition especially eerie to the modern visitor is its intimacy. These weren't anonymous bones. These were community members, friends, relatives. In a village as small and tightly knit as Hallstatt, everyone knew each other. And so, walking through the Beinhaus wasn't like wandering through a graveyard of strangers. It was a visit to old acquaintances. Imagine walking into a chapel where your great-grandfather's skull sits on a shelf, decorated and labeled, right beside your grandmother's. This was not only normal, in Alpstedt it was expected. And because the Beinhaus was part of the church complex, it was folded into daily life. After Sunday Mass, villagers might wander out to visit the ossuaries, say a quiet prayer, or light a candle. Children were not forbidden from entering. There was no attempt to shield them from the reality of death. Instead, the skulls were seen as part of the cycle of life, a reminder of mortality, yes, but also of community. Some skulls were placed in family groupings. Others were arranged by date. But the effect was never random. There was a rhythm to the way the skulls were set on order, shaped by time, reverence, and quiet artistry. Unlike the Grambone chapels of Europe, there are no chandeliers made of femurs here, no theatrical flourishes or towering pyramids, just shelves, skulls, names, and paint. And in some ways, this makes the Hallstatt Beinhaus even more powerful, because there's no spectacle, no attempt to turn death into an architectural marvel. It's just people, reduced to bone, yes, but remembered in full. Still, not everyone found comfort in it. As the 19th century progressed and tourism increased, some outsiders expressed unease. Victorian sensibilities, heavily influenced by death's growing separation from daily life, found the practice unsettling. Travel writers described the Beinhaus in breathless tones, half horrified, half amazed. Some suggested the tradition was pagan. Others misunderstood it entirely. But the villagers knew better. To them, it was never about death for death's sake. It was about remembrance. The skull was not a memento of horror. It was a record of love. And yet, the questions remain. How do we honor the dead without hiding them? And what do we lose when we bury memory beneath silence? In Hallstatt, the painted skulls are more than artistic. Each brushstroke tells a story, and behind every wreath of oak or ivy lies a human life, long past but gently preserved. While cities across Europe distanced themselves from death, concealing it behind high cemetery walls, Orksteromorgs, this Alpine village clung to a slower, older rhythm, one where death sat beside the living, quietly watching, gently remembered. By the 18th century, the painting of skulls had become a ritual in itself. After a skull was exhumed, usually 10 to 15 years after burial, it would be cleaned and left to bleach in the sun for several weeks. This natural whitening process not only prepared the surface for decoration, but was seen as a symbolic purification, a second passing. In a way, it was only once the skull had reached a bone-white finish that the painting would begin. The work was typically done by local artisans, sometimes even by family members of the deceased. Using watercolor pigments, mixed with animal glue or egg, they'd trace floral patterns and initials. They worked carefully, reverently, never rushed. A single skull might take days to finish. Red roses denoted love. Ivy signified eternal life. Black, laurel, or oak meant strengthening. Tiny gold dots or stars hinted at heaven or celestial peace. And then came the name, almost always in careful cursive script across the forehead. The name restored the identity the grave had slowly erased. For those whose families remained in Hallstatt, this was deeply important. It was a way of ensuring their loved one was not lost to time, their presence still tangible, their name still spoken. The finished skull would then be placed with others in the Beinhaus, usually accompanied by the long bones, femurs, and tibia stacked neatly beneath the shelves. The skull was the centerpiece. However, it was what visitors came to see, and where memory lingered longest. Interestingly, the tradition wasn't universal, even within Austria. Most Catholic regions preferred permanent burial or discouraged exhumation altogether. But Hallstatt, isolated and hemmed in by the steep Dockstein Mountains, had always done things differently. The salt mine that gave the town its wealth also gave it its For centuries, trade routes passed through, but cultural change came slowly. Customs that vanished elsewhere remained preserved here, quietly defiant, quietly unchanged. The church never fully opposed the skull painting tradition, though it did raise occasional eyebrows. Local priests, deeply connected to their flocks, often turned a blind eye or participated in the blessings. The Beinhaus was, after all, a sacred space, and the act of decorating bones, while unusual, was rooted in dignity and care. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the practice began to wane. Public attitudes toward death were shifting. With the rise of urbanization, sanitation movements, and secular funerary customs, the idea of keeping skulls on display then reverently felt increasingly out of place. Cremation, once taboo, became more acceptable. Families moved away. The Beinhaus, though still maintained, received fewer new additions. Then came the tourists. Hallstatt's haunting beauty eventually caught the attention of travel writers, painters, and photographers. By the mid-1900s, word of the Bone Chapel had spread. Visitors from across Europe came to see the painted skulls. For some locals, this attention was welcome, a chance to share history. For others, it felt invasive. A sacred tradition had become a curiosity. And yet, the skulls remained. Inside the cool, dim chapel, their painted brows and hollow eyes watched silently as decades passed. Villagers still visited. Flowers were still left. Candles still flickered in corners. And now and then, a new skull would arrive accompanied by a letter, a family's blessing, and a final request to join the quiet congregation of ancestors. In 1983, the final known addition was made. A woman named Anna, who had left Hallstatt as a young girl and lived most of her life abroad, had her remains returned. Her skull, painted with soft blue forget-me-nots, and the phrase Ich ruhe, Gern higher, I rest gladly, here was placed alongside those of her parents and siblings. It was the end of a tradition, but not its disappearance. Today, the Beinhaus stands not just as a relic, but a reminder that memory does not require grandeur, that remembrance does not demand marble or bronze. Sometimes, a single painted skull tucked in a quiet chapel behind a mountain village is enough to carry a soul forward through time. And yet, the Beinhaus also invites quiet questions. What does it mean to be remembered like this? To be part of a wall, a shelf, a tradition long outlived? Does the act of painting a skull restore dignity or freeze it? And if no one paints your name, will you still be remembered at all? By the time you reach the far end of the Beinhaus in Hallstatt, the skulls begin to blur together. Not in detail each. One is unique but in atmosphere. The room is so quiet, the rows so orderly, that your mind starts to soften the individual into the collective. A hush falls over your thoughts. Hundreds of painted faces gaze outward from polished bone, marked not by photos or statues, but by delicate brushwork and human hands. You start to notice other things. The way the skulls darken over time, the fading pigments, the cracked enamel on teeth, some missing altogether, the way the wooden shelves sag slightly with age. And you wonder how much longer will they last. The bones, the paint, the names, even the most carefully tended ossuary is vulnerable. Time moves slowly here, but it still moves. The Beinhaus is not. Its windows are small, letting in beams of alpine sunlight that bleach and warp. Moisture from visitors' breath, seasonal changes in temperature, and even the oils from curious fingers all leave marks. Invisible in the moment, but accumulating like sediment. In recent years, preservation efforts have begun quietly, cautiously. Some skulls have been photographed in high resolution. Researchers have created digital catalogs. A few skulls have been moved to safer storage, especially those with older or more fragile paint. The villagers, fiercely protective of their traditions, are divided. Some welcome conservation. Others fear that the soul of the Beinhaus might be lost in the process. But what is being preserved? Exactly. The bone, the tradition, the idea of visible death. It's not an easy question. Outside, the modern world is changing fast. Hallstatt, once an isolated mountain village, now draws thousands of tourists a year. Its scenic lake views have gone viral online. Influencers pose on the chapel steps. Visitors wander in and out of the Beinhaus with phones raised, snapping selfies beneath the gaze of painted skulls. Most are respectful, but not all. Some locals have quietly asked, is this still a place of remembrance, or has it become a stage? And yet, the skulls persist. They do not change their gaze. They do not protest. They are beyond offense, but they are not beyond meaning. What they offer, perhaps more than any other ossuary in Europe, is a model for intimacy with the dead. Not fear, not grandeur, just proximity. You stand inches away from the face of someone who died centuries ago. Someone who once looked out across the same lake, who walked the same steep paths, who stood in the same church. And they're still here, in a way. Not just spiritually, but physically. We are not used to this. Modern cemeteries are designed for distance-polished stones, trimmed hedges, and burial grounds regulated by rows and rectangles. We visit with flowers and leave quickly. We're discouraged from lingering. The dead are kept beneath, quiet, unseen. But Hallstatt invites the opposite. Here, the dead look back. They do not haunt, but they do not disappear. Their skulls are not hidden underground. They are not medical specimens. They are not decorations. They are reminders of who they were, of who we are, of who we all will become. In this way, the Beinhaus is not morbid. It is meditative. It offers a kind of honesty rarely found elsewhere, a refusal to flinch, a gentle insistence on acknowledgement. And yet, even this tradition faces the erosion of time. Will future generations of Hallstatt residents continue to care for the Beinhaus? Will they repaint fading names? Or will the skulls slowly blur into anonymity? Will the chapel remain open? Or will preservation demand its closure? Will the next Anna be allowed to join her family on the shelf? Or will the tradition, like so many others, slip quietly into memory? In truth, the Beinhaus has already answered in its own way. For centuries, it has withstood weather, war, politics, and progress. It has survived without grandeur, without promotion, and without apology. It has endured because it was loved not by empires, but by villagers. And that love is in the brushstroke, in the ivy garlands, in the quiet. In a world that moves faster every day, Hallstatt's bone chapel stands still. The dead do not speak, but they remain, and their presence poses one final, quiet question. If our names vanish, and our graves grow over, what kind of remembering will we leave behind? Beneath the bright Sicilian sun, amid flowering courtyards and ancient churches, there is a place where the dead don't lie. Quietly beneath the ground but sit. Just outside the city center of Palermo, the Capuchin Catacombs contain one of the most disturbing and strangely serene burial practices in all of Europe. Thousands of mummified bodies, preserved in full clothing, lining hallway after hallway in a monastery's underground vaults. They do not rest in coffins. They hang from walls, lie in open caskets, or recline in glass cases. They wear robes, dresses, boots, gloves. Their skin is tight and dry, their eyes sunken. Some are skeletal, others eerily intact. It is not a place of horror. It is a place of continuity, a monastery of the dead, curated with monastic discipline and surprising tenderness. The catacombs began modestly. In the late 1500s, the Capuchin friars of Palermo found their cemetery full. Like other monastic orders, they faced a dilemma: bury the newly dead, or disinter the old. But when they exhumed one of their own, a friar named Silvestro of Gubbio, they found his body mysteriously preserved. His features still recognizable. It seemed miraculous. The friars took it as a sign. They placed his body in the crypt, propped upright in his robes, and over time began doing the same with others. At first, it was only monks, then wealthy patrons, then clergy, then children. Eventually, over 8,000 bodies would fill the chambers, each preserved in their own way, each frozen in the quiet gravity of death. Walking through the Capuchin catacombs is like stepping into another world. The air is cool and dry. Dim lighting filters through small windows high in the vaults. The floors are stone. The walls are lined with niches, wooden brackets, and shelves, each supporting a human form. Some hang vertically, their arms folded across their chests. Others recline in caskets or alcoves, dressed in fine 19th century clothes, silk bonnets, embroidered waistcoats, polished shoes. But these are not museum mannequins. These are real people, and many still have faces. Some of the corpses were embalmed using complex preservation methods: chemical baths, sun-drying, vinegar rinses, and resin coatings. Others were simply dried naturally in the arid Sicilian air, their flesh shrinking around bone. The friars, over centuries, developed a near-scientific understanding of mummification long before modern embalming techniques were standardized. In fact, it wasn't just preservation that mattered, it was presentation. Families would visit the dead. They'd come down into the crypts to see relatives, to pray, to touch their hands. It was not morbid, but familiar, a continued relationship, uninterrupted by burial. The catacombs are divided by category: monks, men, women, virgins, children, professionals. Each group has its own corridor. There was even a hallway for priests and one for doctors. The dead were placed with those like themselves, mirroring the social structures of the living world. In this way, death did not equal equality. They reflected the hierarchies above, just arranged more quietly, with dust and time. Some of the most striking figures are children, tiny bodies in lace, girls in satin slippers, boys in miniature suits. The most famous among them is Rosalia Lombardo, a 2-year-old girl who died in 1920. Her father, devastated, asked for special preservation. Alucao Imbaume Alfredo Salafia used a secret technique so effective that to this day, Rosalia lies in a glass coffin with skin still smooth, eyelashes still resting against her cheeks. Visitors often mistake her for a doll, and that's where the unease begins to creep in. Because in Palermo, the dead are not hidden away. They are not lowered into graves or cremated into ash. They are displayed, introduced, maintained, and in some cases, adored. The catacombs invite you to see the face of death, not symbolically, but literally. The friars saw it differently. They believed in death as a transition not to be feared, but to be acknowledged. The dead were reminders of the spiritual journey ahead. Memento mori. The flesh will fail, but the soul persists, and the catacombs made this visible. Frightening, yes, but also strangely peaceful. And yet, even among the friars, questions arose. Was it devotion or vanity to be preserved like this? Was the display of the dead a spiritual lesson or a spectacle? And what did it mean when the dead became famous? Because over time, the catacombs attracted attention. Travelers came, writers, scholars, and later photographers. Some came in reverence, others came for the grotesque, and still, the dead remained, unmoving, unchanging, waiting. But what happens when death becomes a portrait? And who, in the end, are we really preserving, the dead or ourselves? To walk the full length of the Capuchin Catacombs is to follow centuries of evolving belief, not just about death, but about memory, visibility, and the line between veneration and vanity. The crypt begins simply with early friars standing in humble robes, hands clasped, eyes sunk into their sockets. But as the chambers stretch deeper, so does the complexity. The garments become finer, the poses more lifelike, the expressions more intentional. It was never meant to be theatrical, and yet, over time, it became difficult to tell where reverence ended and display began. By the 18th and 19th centuries, preservation had grown into something of a skilled trade among the friars. Some bodies were merely dried and dressed. Others were coated in vinegar or soaked in arsenic-laced fluids. The best preserved corpses often belonged to the wealthiest families. It was understood, though never officially admitted, that a discreet donation to the monastery might secure better placement or longer shelf life for the deceased. And the friars, committed to service, complied. Preserved corpses were carefully placed and regularly maintained. Clothing was occasionally changed. Some faces were dusted with powder or treated with oil to preserve the color of the skin. If mold or insects appeared, the body might be relocated or retreated. In rare cases, family members requested their loved one be redressed on anniversaries or birthdays on eerie continuation of care. This level of attention blurred the lines between death and tradition. The catacombs became not just a site of prayer but a social archive. Generations of families could trace their ancestry through the chambers. One corridor held 4 generations of a single family, each man preserved beside his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, with name plaques identifying the lineage. It was not uncommon for children to be brought down to meet deceased relatives. Touching a preserved hand was believed to bring strength. Whispering prayers near the skull of a holy friar was thought to ease suffering. For many Sicilian families, especially those tied to the monastic community, this was not deathed, but visitors didn't always see it that way. By the 1800s, the catacombs had become a destination on the European Grand Tour. Travel diaries described the experience in flowery, often horrified tones. English poets wrote of cloisters of bone, while French painters sketched the chambers in lurid detail. One American visitor described the experience as like walking through a dream in which the dead had paused mid-sentence and turned to stone. With each wave of tourism, the friars found themselves managing not just corpses, but perception. They hung signs urging silence and modest dress. They asked visitors not to photograph or touch the dead, but the curiosity only deepened. In an era increasingly obsessed with anatomy, mortality, and spectacle, the Capuchin Catacombs felt like a cross between a reliquary and a museum, and perhaps that's what they had become. Still, the friars persisted. They saw themselves not as caretakers of a tourist attraction, but as guardians of a spiritual message. To them, The catacombs remained a visual sermon. As you are, so we were. As we are, so you shall be. And that message was above all. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the chamber of Rosalia Lombardo. Rosalia died of pneumonia in 1920. She was 2 years old. Her father, Giuseppe, devastated by the loss, begged for something more than a coffin and a grave. He wanted her preserved, and so he turned to Alfredo Salafia, an embalmer whose formula remains mysterious even today. Salafia's method was remarkably effective. Rosalia was injected with a mixture of formalin, alcohol, glycerin, and salicylic acid, preserving her internal organs, preventing decomposition, and keeping her features almost lifelike. When you look at her today, lying in her tiny glass coffin with a silk ribbon in her hair, it's easy to believe she might simply be sleeping. She became known as La Bella Adorata. Visitors often pause longest at Rosalia's side. Children, especially, seem captivated. Some say they've seen her eyes flutter. Others say her mouth shifts slightly at dawn. These claims are most likely tricks of light, but they speak to something deeper. The illusion that death, when preserved so perfectly, might still contain a fragment of life. And that is what Palermo's catacombs do best. They confront you with that illusion, over and over. The doctor with glasses still perched on his nose. The soldier in his pressed uniform. The woman in mourning dress. One glove missing from her hand. They are dead, and yet, still here. The Capuchin friars viewed this not as defiance, but as meditation. A constant reminder that earthly life is fleeting. That all status, beauty, and power will decay. The body, however preserved, is only a shell, and yet the shell matters. It anchors us. It holds the memory. It gives us something to look at, to talk to grieve. And in Palermo, the dead are not forgotten. They are named, dressed, greeted, seen. But what happens to a tradition when the world around it moves on? In the next section, we'll explore the modern fate of the catacombs, how they endure in a world more focused on science, tourism, and digital memory than spiritual continuity. And we'll ask, what becomes of the dead when they are no longer feared, but no longer sacred either? When you descend into the Capuchin Catacombs today, you're greeted not by monks, but by signs. Multilingual notices remind visitors. No photos, no touching. Silence, please. Cameras watch the corridors, and a quiet tension hums beneath the stone arches. There is reverence, still, but it shares the space with curiosity, commerce, and the complications of modernity. Tour buses line up outside the monastery. Tickets are purchased at kiosks. In peak tourist seasons, the narrow walkways between bodies can become crowded with strangers from every corner of the world, each person reacting differently to the sight of 400-year-old corpses in tattered habits and threadbare shoes. Some walk quickly, eyes down. Others pause for long, silent moments. A few whisper, some stare, and many, despite the signs, still raise their phones for a photograph, unable to resist documenting the confrontation between life and death. For the Capuchin friars, few of whom remain active at the monastery today, the catacombs have become a moral conundrum. The original purpose of the crypt to inspire humility, reflection, and spiritual clarity now exists alongside tourism, commercial brochures, and online reviews. It is listed in guidebooks as a must-see and one of Palermo's most unique attractions, often with stars and ratings, as if the presence of 8,000 preserved corpses could be quantified in stars. And yet the place endures, perhaps because the bones remain silent, unchanging, watching. Rosalia Lombardo, Palermo's sleeping beauty, lies at the center of this tension. Her preservation, miraculous as it is, has made her famous beyond the monastery. Images of her circulate online. Documentaries feature her. Scientists continue to study her, and still, she rests beneath her glass case, surrounded by whispers from those who leaned close. In 2009, her coffin was moved into a specially designed humidity-controlled glass enclosure to protect her from decomposition, caused by increasing foot traffic. Even so, researchers worry that too much exposure, light, warmth, human breath could, and what would be lost then? Would she finally become simply a body, no longer a miracle? The other bodies, less photogenic but no less meaningful, are slowly fading. Clothes decay, bones dry and splinter. Names, once pinned to chests or carved into plaques, fall away, not from neglect but from time. The friars used to maintain the displays, but now, with fewer monks and more regulations, the care is less personal. Conservationists and historians have stepped in. Preservation efforts are underway, but with care comes compromise. Do you clean the faces? Do you redress the dead? Replace missing shoes? Stitch rotting robes? These are not easy decisions. Every act of preservation is also an act of interpretation. At what point does restoration become And deeper still lies the question, why are they here at all? Is this still a spiritual site? Or is it a relic of a belief system? Few remember. Does it serve to warn? To teach? To inspire? Or does it now serve mostly to surprise? In interviews, some visitors say they come to feel closer to death safely. At a distance, others say they leave feeling strangely comforted, having seen so many faces of the dead and survived the encounter. Some are unsettled, others deeply moved. And perhaps that spectrum is the point. The catacombs are not a horror show. They are not sanitized. They are not consistent. They are human. You see a body in priestly vestments, skin shriveled and hands clasped. 2 chambers later, you see a merchant in a faded suit, hat still perched on his head, a woman in lace, crumbling away, a child with hollow cheeks, a man whose skull has collapsed inward, time's final act of erasure. Everywhere, humanity, not in glory or in agony, but in stillness. In a world where death is increasingly abstract, sanitized in hospitals, hidden behind screens, filtered into numbers, the Capuchin Catacombs remain stubbornly physical. They insist that we look, that we recognize ourselves, that we remember that no one, no matter how beloved, how wealthy, how devout, is immune to time. And perhaps, in that way, they still serve the friar's original purpose. Because death, shown this way, doesn't feel like the end. It feels like a transition, a slow fading, not a vanishing. And in that quiet monastery, beneath Palermo's golden light, the dead remain. But memory, too, decays. Beliefs change. Buildings age. And even preserved bodies crumble in the end. So the catacombs raise one final, inescapable question. What happens when those who remember us are gone? Far beneath the elegant boulevards and glowing of Paris lies a second city, dark, quiet, and filled with bones. The catacombs of Paris stretch 4 miles beneath the bustling capital, their walls lined not with bricks, but with human skulls and tibiae, stacked in precise, symmetrical rows. Decorative arrangements of the dead, hidden from the sunlight, stretch onward in echoing tunnels few Parisians ever think about, and fewer still have seen. To most visitors, the catacombs are a macabre, to take photos and to leave with good. But their story is less about horror than about engineering, urban planning, and the sheer logistics of dying in a growing city. In the late 1700s, Paris was suffocating on its own dead. Cemeteries were full. The oldest, like the Cemetery of the Innocents, had been in continuous use for centuries. Bodies were buried layer upon layer, sometimes 30 deep. During rains, bones floated to the surface. The smell in the surrounding neighborhoods was unbearable. Residents near Les Halles complained of rotting flesh seeping into their cellars and water supplies. The church tried to keep up with the burials, but graves were reused constantly, and the city's booming population made the crisis unmanageable. Then came collapse. In 1780, a wall along the Cemetery of the Innocents gave way, spilling half-decomposed corpses into nearby basements. It was a tipping point. Officials decided the cemetery would be closed permanently, and a radical solution was proposed. Transfer the bones. But where to put them? Enter the abandoned limestone quarries beneath the city. Paris, like many old European cities, had been built using the stone beneath its feet. Over the centuries, workers had dug miles of tunnels to extract the pale yellow limestone that gave the city its iconic feel. These tunnels, however, were unmarked and dangerously unsupported in places. Some were collapsing beneath the weight of new development, and so a plan emerged, solved the problems at once. From 1785 onward, under cover of night, horse-drawn carts moved bones from overstuffed cemeteries into the old quarry shafts. Priests accompanied the carts, reciting prayers as the bones were carried through the streets in silence. The transfers took years. Workers piled skulls, femurs, and ribs deep into the old tunnels, creating a new kind of necropolis, one organized not by headstones and family plots, but by function and geometry. But the catacombs as we know them today didn't take shape until the early 1800s. Louis Etienne de Thory was the one who transformed the random piles of bones into structured walls and decorative monuments. He saw the tunnels not only as storage, but as a kind of museum, a quiet archive of mortality. Under his direction, the bones were sorted, arranged, and displayed with symmetry. Skull-lined walls rose with artistic intention. Columns of stacked bones were braced with metal. Inscriptions were added to poetic, some blunt. Stop. This is the Empire of Death. Soon, the catacombs attracted visitors. Initially, it was only the well-connected aristocrats, scientists, writers. Later, even Napoleon toured the tunnels. Eventually, the catacombs opened to the public. They became one of Paris's strangest destinations. Not a place of burial, not a cemetery, but a labyrinth of death woven beneath the city of light. But they were more than morbid decoration. They were functional. By relocating the remains of an estimated 6 million Parisians, the catacombs made room for modern burial practices. They reduced contamination in the water supply. They helped stabilize the ground, and they preserved strangely, unintentionally, centuries of human presence in a form that could not rot further. Walking through the catacombs today, you pass row after row of skulls, many with missing teeth, or once you see leg bones stacked like firewood. Occasionally, you spot a name carved into stone who arranged the tunnel, not someone buried there. The dead themselves remain anonymous, and yet they are not forgotten. You cannot forget them. The catacombs have no sunlight, no birdsong, no wind, just dripping water, distant echoes, and the soft sound of your own footsteps on ancient stone. The air is heavy, almost sweet with damp. Some areas are off limits, others are patrolled. Tourists are shown only a fraction of the total network, less than 2 kilometers of the roughly 300 kilometers of tunnel, and yet, people find ways in. There is an entire subculture of Parisian urban explorers known as catapholes, those who navigate the closed-off sections of the catacombs illegally, often spending nights in forgotten corners, mapping passages, or holding secret concerts and exhibitions underground. They speak of bones hidden far from tourists, rooms decorated with skeletal mosaics, entire caverns untouched for decades. Some claim to have found skulls in unmarked side chambers. Others speak of rooms filled with graffiti and candles, where modern life and ancient death blur together in strange communion. But for all their mystery, the Paris catacombs began not with superstition, but with city planning. They exist because death could no longer be managed on the surface, and so the city buried itself layer by layer until its very foundations were made of bones. But what happens to a city when the ground beneath its feet belongs more to the dead than the living? Most visitors to the Paris catacombs see only a carefully controlled version of the truth, a guided path, a beginning and an end, security at the door, emergency lighting, tourist-friendly signage, but behind locked gates and crumbling stone, there lies another Paris, a deeper Paris, hidden within the forgotten tunnels, shafts, and flooded quarries that spider beneath the city in complete darkness. For those who seek it, this underground world is not just a curiosity, it's a calling. These are the catapholes explorers of the forbidden catacombs, equal parts urban archaeologists, adventurers. They slip into the off-limits sections of the Paris underworld through sewer grates, basement doors, or hidden manholes in quiet neighborhoods. They know the turns by heart. They memorize the sound of the water, and many know the bones personally. The French government has officially restricted access to the non-tourist areas of the catacombs since the 1950s. Police patrol the tunnel network, and those caught can be fined. Yet this hasn't stopped the movement. In fact, the restrictions have only deepened the mystery. Maps are copied by hand. Secret entrances passed down like family recipes. There are rules, quiet, unspoken, but firm. Respect the dead. Leave no trash. No tagging of bone walls. Do not take, do not disturb. Most cataphilers consider themselves stewards of the underground city. Some spend years mapping the passages. Others document historical scratched into stone by quarrymen in the 1700s. A few even maintain small libraries or art galleries deep in the tunnels, lit by candles, untouched by time. But among the silence, there is danger. The tunnels are not uniform. Some ceilings collapse, some chambers flood. Without a map, it's easy to get lost. The temperature stays around 14 degrees Celsius here. It's cold, dark, and damp. If your flashlight dies, and you don't know your path, you may never find your way back. There are stories unverified but persistent of people who disappeared into the tunnels, never to return. A security camera once captured eerie footage of an abandoned camcorder in a remote part of the catacombs. Its last recordings featuring heavy breathing and the sound of someone running. Was it a hoax, a lost explorer, or something else entirely? But most cataphiles aren't chasing ghosts. They're chasing meaning. They describe the catacombs as a place where time folds in on itself. You can walk from Roman ruins to 18th century mine supports in minutes. One turn brings you into a corridor lined with skulls. Another opens into a perfectly circular chamber where sound echoes endlessly, a place called the Room of Echoes, where cataphiles go to recite poetry or sit in silence. And then there are the bone room's hidden caches, far from the public tunnels, where bones were once dumped without formal arrangement. Unlike the decorative galleries, these piles are chaotic. Skulls, femurs, ribs, and spine fragments heaped in mounds, sometimes half buried in dust. Many of these sites are undocumented, their origins unknown. Not every cemetery transfer was carefully logged. Some were rushed, some were forgotten. To stumble upon such a room is like entering a pocket of the past that never closed. You feel not watched, exactly, but known, aware of your breathing, aware of your pulse, aware that you are the only living thing for many meters in every direction. Cataphiles treat these rooms with reverence. Some light candles, some leave messages, some simply sit in silence and listen to the water trickling through limestone far above. There's a belief, whispered but rarely admitted aloud, that the bones remember, that in the stillness, something remains. This belief has created rituals, annual underground gatherings on All Saints' Day, shared meals in hidden alcoves, art installations that use light and shadow to reanimate the skulls, performances played on cello or whispered poetry under vaulted ceilings where no one but the dead are listening. The police, of course, disapprove. Periodic crackdowns, close entrances, fines are issued, but the cataphiles always return, because the catacombs are more than a destination. They are a mirror. Above ground, Paris moves quickly. Lights flicker, hum, phones buzz, but beneath it all, the catacombs wait unchanged, unbothered. They do not ask to be visited. They do not demand reverence. But when you step into their realm, when you walk among 6 million unnamed dead, when your footsteps echo across gravel and skull, something shifts. And whether you're there as a tourist, a wanderer, or an illegal guest of the deep, you're forced to confront one quiet question. In a city made of memory, what part of us truly endures? If you walk through Paris today, down Rue de la Tombessoir, or past Denfert Trochereau station, it's unlikely you'll sense what lies below. The air smells of pastry, not limestone, brim with life, not silence. Yet beneath your footsteps, the bones of 6 million Parisians lie in symmetrical stacks, undisturbed but not entirely forgotten. For a city so obsessed with art, memory, and revolution, the catacombs remain its most honest monument because, unlike statues and plaques, bones cannot lie. But how long will they be remembered? In the centuries since their creation, the Paris catacombs have undergone a slow metamorphosis. What began as a solution to a civic crisis became a spectacle, then a mystery, and now, like much of Paris, something curated. The public path is clean. The walls are reinforced. Plaques guide your thought. And still, even within the managed walkways, the presence of death is overwhelming. Visitors often describe a strange calm, not fear exactly, but gravity. The neatness of the bones is what unsettles most. There's a plaque near the entrance that reads Arrête, c'est ici l'Empire de la Mort. Stop. This is the Empire of Death. It's more than a warning. It's an instruction. Because here, beneath the fashion houses and jazz bars, the bones do not entertain. They outlast. And yet, memory is fickle. Despite the catacombs' fame, many Parisians live their entire lives without visiting them. The tunnels don't feature in school curricula. They don't appear in political discourse or city planning debates. That wasn't always the case. In the 19th century, the catacombs were seen as part of the city's identity. Writers and philosophers visited them to meditate on death and time. Painters descended with oil lamps to sketch the skull-lined corridors. Victor Hugo wrote about the Paris underground not just as metaphor, but as literal structure where revolution, poverty, and history converged. Today, that role has faded. The catacombs are no longer a philosophical haunt, but a tourist attraction. Tickets are sold online in advance. The line can stretch 4 blocks. Inside, audio guides speak in gentle tones about the history of the tunnels, the logistics of moving bones, and the remarkable preservation of 18th century death. But something is missing. Because while the catacombs have been catalogued and sanitized, the original chaos, the fear, the desperation, the rot has been edited out. The catacombs began with a city choking on its dead. Bones spilled into basements. Graves collapsed. The stink was unbearable. That horror is largely gone now, replaced by lighting and signage. But it was real, and it shaped the Paris we know. And beneath that, deeper still, lies another question. What becomes of us when we are no longer individuals, but infrastructure? When our bones are no longer mourned, but organized? The catacombs are not a cemetery. In the traditional sense, there are no names, no dates, no epitaph. A few plaques mention which cemetery the bones came from. Montmartre, less innocence, but the anonymous become geometry. The person becomes pattern. And that, in its own way, is terrifying. Not because it suggests cruelty, but because it suggests forgetting. That we can live, die, and disappear into the walls of a tunnel hour. Stories folded into symmetry and silence. And yet, maybe that's what the catacombs offer most of all. A form of humility. A reminder that cities are built not just by the living, but by the dead. That beneath every street and station and museum lie the remnants of lives once as full as ours. People who loved and wept, who walked in sunlight and feared the dark, who now rest in rows, unmoving but not unnoticed. So when you walk the streets of Paris at night, when the city glows softly and your footsteps echo on cobblestones polished by centuries, remember that someone else once walked there too, and now they wait quietly below. Because in the end, every great city becomes its own tomb. The question is, will we remember the silence beneath our noise? Long before the Spanish arrived with their muskets and churches, before the fall of the Inca Empire and the rewriting of Andean history, the people of ancient Peru lived in a world where the dead were anything but silent. In the mountain valleys and desert plains, the line between life and death was not a wall, it was a doorway. And sometimes, the dead walked right through it. Among the many civilizations that flourished in the Andes, the Nazca, the Mocha, the Chachapoya, and the Inca veneration wasn't just a belief. It was a way of life. The dead were active participants in society. Their remains, particularly skulls and mummified bodies, were preserved, displayed, consulted, and even transported from place to place. In some cases, they were kept seated in bundles in family homes. In others, they were arranged in crypts facing the sunrise, wrapped in textiles and bound with ropes. Often, they were brought out during festivals, offered food, drink, and music. Skulls were decorated, faces were painted, and the spirits of the dead, it was believed, could hear, advise, and protect. To modern eyes, this may seem unsettling, but to the Andean worldview, it made perfect sense. Life continued after death, not in another realm, but alongside the living. The ancestors weren't gone, they had simply changed form. One of the most vivid examples of this belief comes from the coastal regions of what is now Peru, where archaeologists have uncovered skull shrines, collections of human crania arranged in ceremonial pattern. Often, these skulls belonged to specific family lines, community leaders, or honored warriors. They were sometimes marked with red paint, adorned with cords of human hair, or placed atop woven mats. Some shrines were found near irrigation canals, as if the ancestors were being positioned to watch over the lifeblood of the land. Others were buried near maize fields, their hollow eyes staring skyward, ensuring the crops grew strong. There are even records, taken from early Spanish chronicles, of Andean villagers consulting their ancestors before planting or traveling, seeking guidance, not through seances or prayer, but by physically sitting before the skulls and speaking. But it wasn't just skulls. The practice of mummifying whole bodies, especially among the Inca, was widespread. The most important dead, often rulers or high priests, were preserved in elaborate funerary bundles, wrapped in layers of fine fabric and seated in fetal positions, as if waiting to be reborn. These bundles were stored in sacred caves or niches carved into rock faces. Some were housed in temples, others were hidden in remote mountain shrines, their locations known only to select members of the community. And these mummies weren't left alone. They were fed small bowls of maize or chicha, left near their feet. They were dressed in fresh clothing. They were even consulted during political decisions. In the Inca capital of Cusco, mummies of dead emperors were kept in state when the empire faced difficult choices whether to go to war, move settlements, or change agricultural policy. The high priests would ask the mummies what to do. The answers were interpreted through rituals: smoke, offerings, patterns in spilled liquid, and though the dead did not speak, their influence was powerful. This system of ancestor veneration wasn't limited to elite, orderly families. 2. Kept the skulls or partial remains of loved ones close. In some homes, archaeologists have found shelves with ancestral bones, carefully cleaned and wrapped. Some were given small headdresses, others were adorned with beads or animal teeth. It was common for children to grow up knowing the names and stories of the bones in their own homes. And there was no fear in this. The dead were not ghosts. They were kin. Their physical remains were a connection, not a threat. The skull was not a symbol of decay, it was a vessel of wisdom, a companion to daily life. Spanish colonizers, of course, saw things differently. When they arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, they were horrified by what they found. Skulls on altars, mummies seated in temples, people feeding the dead and speaking to them openly. The Spanish viewed it as pagan, profane, even demonic. They burned mummies, smashed skull shrines, and buried ancestor bundles deep in the earth. They built churches atop sacred burial caves. They banned rituals that had persisted for centuries. But the practices never fully disappeared. In remote communities, traditions continued in secret. Skulls were hidden behind walls. Bones were passed quietly between generations. Some families buried ancestor bundles beneath floors or behind church altars close enough to remain near, but hidden from colonial eyes. The relationship with the dead did not die. It adapted. Even today, echoes remain. In parts of rural Peru and Bolivia, the tradition of keeping ancestral skulls survives now, blended with Catholic imagery and terminology. People light candles for the dead, speak to them, leave food and drink. On certain days of the year, especially during Dia de los Difuntos, families bring out decorated skulls, dressing them, singing to them, and thanking them for their protection. And the skulls seem to smile back, their features worn by centuries, but their presence undiminished. Because, in the Andes, death is not a silence. It is a conversation, and the bones, if you know how to listen, are never done speaking. To understand how the people of the Andes lived with their dead, you have to set aside much of what modern cultures assume about death. In most parts of the world today, death is seen as final, tidy, and private. Bodies are buried or burned, tombs are sealed, and remembrance happens in cemeteries of photographs. But for much of pre-colonial Andean history, death was simply a shift in presence. The dead didn't leave, they stayed. And they had things to say. In highland Peru, even after Spanish colonization, people continued to engage with the bones of their ancestors. One remarkable practice was the consultation of Malquitha Quechua, word for an ancestral mummy or sacred dead. These Malqui weren't silent effigies. They were active members of the social and spiritual landscape. And while the Spanish destroyed many of them in their conquest, the memories and sometimes the remains. A Malqui might be housed in a communal cave, carefully wrapped in cloth and surrounded by offerings. Or it might be kept closer inside a home, a shrine, or even beneath the floor. Andean people visited these ancestors during times of uncertainty. Before planting season, after the birth of a child, during illness, or before a journey. They brought gifts, coca leaves, maize beer, woven cloth, or small feet. They spoke out loud, asking for advice or favor, and through some. This was not superstition. It was a dialogue. In some regions, such as the highlands near Lake Titicaca, skulls were kept in niches carved into adobe walls, known as natitas. These skulls were venerated like protective spirits. People fed them, dressed them, and spoke to them daily. They were often believed to bring good health, strong crops, or protection from misfortune. When asked how they knew the skull was listening, locals often replied, "You just know when a skull loves you." The Catholic Church, from the colonial period through the 20th century, attempted to eradicate these practices. Priests confiscated skulls, discouraged shrine building, and rewrote religious festivals to eliminate ancestor rituals. But the bones stayed, even in urban cemeteries today, especially around All Saints' Day, Dia de las Ñatitas. In Bolivia, people still bring skulls of relatives or community elders to visit the living. These skulls are cleaned, adorned with flowers and hats, given cigarettes or coca leaves. Musicians are sometimes hired to serenade them, and families sit beside them, chatting softly, laughing, remembering. The skulls are not morbid. They are familiar. Archaeologically, this continuity has deep roots. In burial sites across the Andes, from the coastal Chincay region to the Alps, Researchers have found that bones were not always interred once. Many bodies were buried, disinterred, moved, and reburied sometimes more than once. Bones were rewrapped, arranged, honored. In some cases, skulls were separated and stored in communal bundles, while long bones were placed with others. This reconfiguration wasn't random, it was symbolic. It linked family lines. It restructured spiritual relationships. It kept a memory alive. The Spanish, faced with such practices, often misunderstood them. They called them heretical. They assumed they were remnants of What they failed to grasp was that the Andean dead weren't gods. They were kin. Even today, the idea of relational death lingers in rural language. Elders speak of ancestors not as gone, but as with us. In another way, dreams are taken seriously, especially dreams involving deceased family. Children are taught to speak respectfully to photos or heirlooms. And some communities still bury the placenta of newborns beside ancestral graves, tying new life to old. In this worldview, a skull isn't a warning. It's an anchor, a way of staying grounded. And in times of upheaval during war, famine, colonization, or displacement, this connection to the dead becomes even more important. When everything else changes, the bones stay. This deep cultural memory is etched into the landscape. Across the Andes, there are thousands of Cholpas-ancient funerary towers built from stone or adobe. Many stand alone in high mountain passes or vast plains. Inside, they once held bundles of the dead, positioned upright, facing the rising sun. Some still do. In places where Spanish influence never fully erased the past, local shepherds or travelers still leave small offerings at these sites. Coca leaves tucked into cracks, coins left on stone thresholds. These gestures are quiet. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just a shared understanding that someone is still there, and that presence deserves respect. The Andean relationship with death is not about fear, it's about continuity. When a person dies, they become a guardian. When their body is preserved, it anchors the community. When their skull is venerated, it offers comfort, even joy. And that joy is subtle, but real. In an age of forensic science and digital memorials, the Andean tradition reminds us that memory is physical, that a bone can hold more than calcium. It can hold stories, it can hold protection, it can hold love. And if you pass through a mountain village during festival season and see a skull sitting on a blanket with flowers in its eye sockets and a candle flickering beside it, you're not seeing superstition, you're seeing family. Because in the Andes, the dead don't rest below. They sit beside you, watching and waiting for you to speak. As the Andes descend into shadow at the end of each day, villagers across Peru and Bolivia grow still. Smoke rises in thin trails from clay chimneys. Dogs bark at unseen things. Children are called home, and in some homes a quiet greeting is spoken. A bowl of chicha is set beside it. This is not superstition. This is family ritual, passed down through generations. And the skull, watching from its niche, knows everyone in the room by name. The persistence of ancestor veneration in the Andes is not just a cultural quirk, it is an act of resistance. It is a worldview that has outlived conquest, colonization, evangelism, globalization, and bureaucracy. Through centuries of suppression and change, these bones have remained quiet, constant, and meaningful. In Bolivia, the festival of the Atitas, the Little Skulls, continues each November, just after All Saints' Day. People bring skulls, sometimes of named relatives, sometimes of unknown origins, to cemeteries and chapels for blessing. Skulls are dressed in hats, sunglasses, flower crowns. They're placed in glass boxes or on embroidered cloth. A priest may offer a Catholic blessing, and nearby, someone lights a cigarette and tucks it between the skull's teeth. The practice is strange to outsiders, but to those who participate, it's comforting. You ask the skull for help, guidance, health, peace. You thank it for protection. You care for it. You decorate it. You smile at it. You remember. Many of these skulls are inherited, passed down through families. Others are adopted, found during construction, or acquired through the black market of antique bones. Some skulls have no known name, but are believed to have found a home in the household that keeps them. In this belief system, this skull chooses you as much as you choose it. This relationship is deeply reciprocal. If a skull brings blessings, you feed it. You clean it. If it becomes restless through neglect or disrespect, it's believed to cause illness, misfortune. Like any guest, it must be treated with care, not because it demands power, but because it deserves dignity. Archaeologists studying these traditions often find themselves confronting a paradox. On one hand, the skull is treated as a relic. On the other, it is treated as a living being. It is cleaned with soft cloths, perfumed, spoken to, introduced to children as a member of the family. And in a way, the presence of these skulls is stabilizing in a world that remains harsh. Rural Andean life, especially in isolated areas, is still marked by poverty, marginalization, and limited infrastructure. In communities where healthcare is scarce and government presence minimal, people turn to what they trust and what they've always known: their dead, and their dead answer. In the oral stories passed between generations, there are countless tales of skulls protecting households, warning of fire, warding off thieves, helping the sick recover. These stories aren't ghost stories. They aren't meant to scare. They're meant to explain how connection to the past keeps the present whole. The integration of Catholicism into these traditions has created a rich form of syncretism. Altars often include both crucifixes and skulls. A prayer to the Virgin Mary might be followed by a whispered greeting to a grandmother's remains. Saints and ancestors share the same shelf. The Church, in many regions, has learned not to interfere. In some places, local clergy participate. In others, they quietly permit what they cannot erase. Even in urban areas, the tradition persists. In La Paz, Bolivia, vendors in markets sell miniature hats and sunglasses sized for skulls. People keep small yatita shrines in apartments. Others leave offerings at public altars where anonymous skulls reside, ones with no family left to tend them. The skulls, then, become communal. A shared memory, a shared protector. This practice has caught the attention of anthropologists, spiritual historians, and even artists. Exhibitions have featured Yatut-inspired installations. Scholars have tried to catalog the tradition's variants. But no study or exhibition can fully capture the quiet bond between a person and a skull that has sat in their home for 50 years. Because these bones are not about death. They are about relationship. They are about survival. And as long as they are honored, the people who keep them feel grounded, even in a world spinning faster and forgetting more. But what happens when that relationship fades? In cities, modernization threatens these traditions. Younger generations sometimes feel disconnected. Urban housing codes discourage skulking. Digital life moves too quickly for the slow intimacy of bone rituals. And still, the skulls remain, waiting quietly on shelves, in closets, or buried beneath floors, waiting to be spoken to again, waiting for their names to be remembered. And perhaps that's the lesson. The skull doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It doesn't haunt. It simply remains. And its presence, over centuries, whispers one thing: if you do not forget me, I will never leave you. In a quiet suburb of Kutná Hora in the Czech Republic stands a small, unassuming chapel. From the outside, it looks like any other Gothic church: modest, pale stone, a peaked roof, a cross at the spire. Tourists passing through might not give it more than a glance, but step inside, and you will find yourself face to face with something both haunting and sublime. Because every wall, every arch, every chandelier and garland in the Sedlec ossuary is made not of wood or marble but of human bones. Tens of thousands of them, femurs arranged into looping wreaths, skulls stacked into towers, a chandelier that contains at least one of every bone in the human body. Even the altar and the family coat of arms, meticulously rendered in vertebrae and jawbones, are composed entirely of remains. And yet, for all its grim materials, the chapel doesn't feel grotesque. It feels quiet, peaceful, devout. The Sedlec ossuary is one of the world's most iconic bone churches, and perhaps its most elaborately decorated. But its origins are not theatrical. Like many such sites, the ossuary began with a blessing. In the 13th century, an abbot from the Cistercian monastery at Sedlec was sent on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. While there, he collected a small vial of soil from Golgotha, the hill where Christ was crucified, and brought it back to the monastery grounds. He scattered it across the cemetery beside the chapel, and word quickly spread. Suddenly, Sedlec was considered holy land. People came from across Central Europe to be buried in its soil. And then came the plagues. The Black Death hit in the mid-14th century, followed by the Hussite Wars a century later. The cemetery quickly overflowed. Thousands of bodies were buried, layer upon layer, and eventually, space ran out. The monks began the painstaking process of exhuming older remains to make room for the newly dead. But what to do with the bones? They were sacred. They couldn't be discarded. they had to be preserved. At first, they were stored in a crypt beneath the chapel, stacked in neat rows. A charnel house, quiet, functional, respectful. But in the 16th century, a half-blind monk was given the task of arranging the bones more artfully. He sorted them by type. He built pyramids of skulls and ribs. He gave shape to death. Then, in 1870, a local woodcarver named František Rindt was commissioned by the noble Schwarzenberg family to bring order and meaning to the ossuary. What he created was staggering. With the patience of a sculptor and the devotion of a monk, Rindt cleaned and arranged the remains of more than 40,000 people into patterns of precise symmetry. His signature carved in bone still rests near the staircase. But Rindt didn't intend horror. The chapel wasn't designed to frighten. It was built as a visual meditation on mortality. Death, in the Catholic worldview, is not the end. The bones are what remain. They are what rise again at the resurrection. And so, to build beauty from bones was not a desecration. Walking into the Sedlec ossuary today, the first thing you notice is the quiet. Tourists speak in hushed tones. The walls do not echo. The light is dim, filtered through small stained glass windows. The air smells faintly of stone and old dust. And then your eyes adjust. The chandelier hangs from the center of the nave, dripping with bones, metacarpals, clavicles, vertebrae. Below it, pyramids of skulls rise from the floor. The Schwarzenberg family crest gleams on one wall, rendered entirely in bone, complete with a raven's beak made of pelvic bone piercing an ocular cavity. It should be overwhelming. It should be too much. But instead, it feels still. Because every piece has its place. Every femur is part of an arch. Every tibia helps support a crown. Death, here, is not random. It is composed. And yet, even among the structure, the weight of what you're seeing begins to gather in your chest. These were people, 40,000 individuals. No names, no stories, no identities, just pieces, bones. Were they soldiers, mothers, children, plague victims, monks? Did they know, as they were buried, that their remains would one day form chandeliers, that their skulls would become columns in a chapel's ceiling? It's not likely. The chapel offers no answers, no placards with no labels on the bones. The anonymity is complete, and that, in a way, is the most powerful part, because it forces the visitor to reckon not with individual death, but with mortality itself, with scale, with the reality that someday, we too will be reduced to form and memory. And perhaps, if we're lucky to beauty, the Sedlec ossuary is not unique in Europe. Other bone chapels exist in Portugal, Rome's Capuchin crypts, Brno's underground but none quite combine art and mortality the way Sedlec does. It is not a place of fear. It is a place of remembrance. A reminder carved in calcium and arranged by candlelight that death is neither ugly nor distant. It is part of the pattern. And every time a visitor descends the narrow stone stairs into the chapel, brushing past the ribs of strangers long dead, the pattern expands quietly, like the echo of a hymn sung centuries ago. But what, then, becomes of the self when your bones belong to everyone? The longer you remain in the Sedlec ossuary, the more the shapes begin to speak. The chandelier at the center of the chapel draws your eye first, its familiar form rendered unfamiliar through femurs and mandibles, but then the arches rise, then the garlands. Loop, and soon you begin to notice. The chapel is not filled with bones. It is built from them. They are the structure, the design, the very message. It is a strange kind of beauty. It feels, at times, wrong to be so visually moved by a room made entirely from the remains of the dead. And yet that is precisely what makes Sedlec so powerful. It does not ask you to look away. It insists that you look closer. František Rindt, the 19th century craftsman behind the chapel's most iconic arrangements, was not trying to shock. His training was in woodwork, not sculpture. But when asked to bring order to the chaos of thousands of bones, he turned to what he knew: symmetry, structure. He bleached each bone with lime for consistency. He sorted by size. He began to build. But rather than hiding the bones away, he elevated them. The chandelier hangs at the center of the space, not as a centerpiece of vanity. Rindt is believed to have used at least one of every human bone in its construction. Vertebrae form spirals. Pelvic bones support columns. Tiny finger bones line the edges, like lace. It's almost impossible to comprehend until you've stood beneath it, looking up, knowing every piece once carried a life. Other designs are more overt in their symbolism. The garlands that run between the vaults resemble celebratory in shape, funerary in tone. The coats of arms nod toward legacy, but also dominance. The bones of the poor, the plague-stricken, and the anonymous now carry the name of a wealthy noble house. And yet there is no gloating here. Only order. Only stillness. Even the great bone pyramids, stacked skulls and long bones rising toward the ceiling feel humble. There are no names, no inscriptions, only the repetition of form, the silence of scale. Visitors often describe the ossuary as peaceful, quiet, even soothing. But for some, the quiet feels weighted, oppressive, as if the dead are not just remembered, but waiting. Who were they? We will never know. The records were lost. The cemetery had been in use for centuries before the ossuary was constructed. By the time the bones were exhumed and sorted, any traces of individual identity had already faded, erased by time, soil, and the practical demands of death management. And so, Sedlec became a chapel of anonymity, a space where the dead have lost their names but gained something else: shape, permanence, visibility. They are not mourned, but they are not forgotten either. The role of anonymity here is more than accidental. It's philosophical. In medieval Catholic theology, the individual's soul mattered, but so did the idea of collective mortality. Memento mori was not just a reminder of death, but a reminder of your place in the divine order. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, monk or soldier, you would die, you would decay, and in death, your bones would become like everyone else's. Sedlec crystallizes that belief into architecture. The chapel isn't merely a storage solution or artistic curiosity. It's a literal rendering of the idea that death levels all. The bones are no longer yours or mine. They're everyone's. They hold up arches. They rest on altars. They frame light. And this transformation from human body to building material is strangely comforting, because it suggests that, even in death, there is use. There is beauty. There's a place for you in the pattern. Some modern visitors are unsettled by this. The lack of names, the absence of individual identity, the idea that your body might one day become part of a wall. But for many of those buried here, it might have been an honor to rest beneath the floor of a chapel, to become part of something greater, to rise again, not as a person, but as part of a sacred space. And in this, Sedlec becomes not only a chapel of death, but a chapel of trust. Trust that the monks would keep your bones safe. Trust that the community would remember you not by name, perhaps, but by number, by structure, by devotion. There are other ossuaries in the world, but few are this orderly. Few show this balance between intimacy and anonymity. Few remind us so clearly that when all is stripped away, what remains is form, rhythm, connection. To look at Sedlec's ceiling is to look at a sky of mortality, but not one that looms, one that holds, one that surrounds. And it leaves you wondering, if your bones could be arranged into beauty, would you mind being forgotten by name? If you are remembered by design, as your eyes adjust to the low light of the Sedlec ossuary, and your ears become accustomed to the absence of sound, something shifts. The arrangement of bones, which at first felt decorative or even startling, now feels inevitable, as if no other material could have built this place, as if stone would have been too cold and wood too weak. The bones, in their mute thousands, create a space where the physical and the symbolic are inseparable, and in this, Sedlec's meaning deepens. It is not simply a church lined with remains. It is a cathedral built of death and shaped by reverence, a reminder that beauty does not have to come from life alone. But what does it mean to be remembered without a name? Two modern sensibilities. This is an uneasy idea. Much of how we grieve is centered around identity. Photographs, gravestones, stories. We mark lives with plaques, dates, memoirs, and digital footprints. But Sedlec reminds us that for much of history and, for most people, the afterlife of the body was not about individual memory. It was about belonging to a whole. In death, these people joined the chapel. They joined the arches, the vaults, the rhythms of light and dust. And their memory, though silent, remains present in the structure itself. Every visitor who walks beneath the chandelier does so beneath thousands of former lives. Every moment of stillness in the chapel is shared with those who no longer breathe, but who still surround. It is worth noting that the bones are not locked away. Unlike museums, where human remains are stored behind glass or under archival lighting, Sedlec presents them openly. You walk beside them. You do not peer down at them from a platform. You are among them, and in that proximity, something sacred forms. It's not spectacle. It's not morbid fascination. It's quiet company. Many visitors don't speak while they're in the chapel, not out of fear, but respect. The hush is not enforced. It simply happens. Tourists lower their voices. Children stop asking questions. Even the clicking of cameras seems to fade. You begin to walk more slowly. You begin to notice how the dust catches light on a skull's curve, or how the jaw of one face seems to tilt upward in thought. They're not just bones, they're remains. And to remain is not the same as to be forgotten. Sedlic, more than any other ossuary, insists on this point. Its very existence was an act of memory. When the cemetery overflowed, the monks didn't bury the old bones deeper or dispose of them. They kept them. They honored them. They gave them a home. In doing so, they created a space where the dead are not marginalized. They are central. But what of the living? Every day, visitors from around the world pass through this chapel. Some come out of curiosity. Others come out of reverence. A few don't quite know why they came, only that they felt they should. And all leave differently than they entered. Some describe a sense of peace. Others speak of perspective. A few find it disturbing. But almost everyone agrees. You leave with a different awareness of your own body, your own bones, the scaffolding beneath your skin. The idea that one day, that scaffolding could outlast your name. It could outlast your story. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's a kind of peace. The Sedlic ossuary is not about denying death. It is about folding it into form. It is about the idea that even when breath ends, shape continues. That your body, in its most basic form, still belongs to a chapel, to a community, to a pattern larger than yourself. And in that pattern, there is grace. You do not know the names of those around you in the chapel, but you walk more carefully. You lower your voice. You look upward, and maybe you whisper thank you, not knowing exactly to whom. Because someone stood where you now stand. Someone wept. Someone died. Someone became part of the wall you lean against. And now, they hold the shape of silence. They are not lost. They are not alone. They are not idle. They are here, still forming arches, still framing light, still watching. And so you ask yourself, when I am gone, what will hold me a stone, a name, or a place like this, where silence makes me part of something beautiful? In the peaceful villages that dot the Bavarian Alps, where snow settles softly on steep roofs, and church bells echo down winding cobbled lanes, there are places where the dead remain, not under stone or earth, but sitting quietly on wooden shelves. These are the bone houses, and, while they are easy to overlook, they hold a centuries-old tradition of remembering the dead in silence, simplicity, and would most travelers to southern Germany or Austria focus on the castles, the markets, the Alpine vistas. But tucked behind village churches or beside graveyards, you might find a modest outbuilding with narrow windows and thick walls. Inside, rows of skulls line the shelves. Jawbones rest in neat boxes. Femurs and tibia stacked like cords of firewood. There are no chandeliers, no elaborate arrangements, just order, care, stillness. The Bavarian Beinhaus tradition, like others across Europe, arose out of necessity. In small mountain villages, space was always limited. The rocky soil and short growing season meant graveyards could not expand easily. Winters were long. Plots were reused. And over time, as older graves were exhumed to make room for the newly dead, the bones had to go somewhere, but they were never thrown away. In Catholic belief, the body, even reduced to bone, remains sacred. It waits patiently for resurrection, and so the bones were cleaned, dried, and placed carefully in ossuaries, bone houses often attached to the church or built beside the cemetery wall. Here, the bones remained part of the community, sheltered, safe, remembered. Most Bavarian ossuaries are small. Some hold only a few hundred individuals. Others contain thousands. They rarely bear names. But some skulls are marked with initials, dates, or even painted wreaths. A tradition found more commonly in Austria than Germany. These painted skulls echo the more famous Beinhaus of Halle. But they also appear in isolated parts of Bavaria, where families sometimes traced floral patterns, or added small crosses to distinguish their ancestors. Stepping inside one of these ossuaries, you are struck by their restraint. There are no displays, no plaques, no explanations, just shells, wood, bone, dust, and light, soft, filtered through tiny windows that keep out wind and glare. The air smells of timber and stone. The silence is complete. You feel you should whisper, though there is no one to hear. Some of the skulls are stacked in double rows, ones on the bottom, smaller on top. Others sit behind wire grills. In some ossuaries, bones have been arranged by type. femurs in one corner, pelvises in another, ribs and slatted bins like kindling. There is no sense of chaos, only care. These are not mass graves. They are curated collections, and the curators were often local priests or sextons, tasked with preserving the spiritual dignity of the remains. They cleaned the bones, dusted the shelves, said prayers during the Feast of All Souls. Some villages still observe these rituals today, but the ossuaries were never morbid. In fact, they were deeply practical. In mountain villages with harsh winters and little space, the cycle of burial and exhumation was understood as normal. Graves were often leased, not owned. A person might rest in the earth for 10 or 20 years, after which, if the grave was needed, the bones would be moved. This was not considered disrespectful. It was a return to the community, a shift from private resting place to public memory. And for those left behind, the ossuary offered a place to visit, to pray, to remember. Not everyone could afford a gravestone, but a skull on a shelf, especially one lovingly marked, was something a family could see, touch, and honor. In some ossuaries, candles were lit. In others, flowers were left on the stone sill. Children were brought in quietly, taught to show respect. A hand on the shoulder, a whispered name, a candle placed below a shelf where a grandfather's skull still waited. In this way, the Beinhaus served not just the dead but the living. It reminded villagers that death was not disappearance, that the body, even stripped of flesh, could still participate in community, could still be seen, and perhaps more importantly, it reminded everyone that life, too, was temporary. That one day, their bones might sit on that same shelf. But this was not frightening, because the shelf was inside the church, because the bones were not alone, because they, too, would be remembered, even if only by the pattern of their teeth, even if only by the shape of their skull, even if only by a name whispered once a year, when the candles were lit and the bell rang out across the snowy fields. In places like these, death is not the end of presence, only the beginning of stillness. In the mountain villages of Bavaria and the Tyrol, life has always moved to a slower rhythm. Seasons arrive with purpose, bells ring on time, snow melts into planting, and with this rhythm comes a deeply human awareness of space. Not just in the fields or on narrow streets, but in the graveyard. Each village had only so much land. Carving out new plots in the alpine soil was a challenge, stone hard in winter, too shallow in spring, sloped and precarious in every other season. But the dead kept coming, so the villagers adapted. Burial wasn't permanent. It was part of a cycle. Graves were leased, usually for 10 or 20 years. Families paid a modest fee to use the plot. In that time, the grave was tended, often marked with a wooden cross or a small wrought iron sign, nothing elaborate, just enough to say, "Here lies someone who is loved." But when the lease ended, and no one renewed, the bones were carefully removed. The grave was reused, and the remains were brought to the Beinhaus. This practice, known as secondary burial, was not unique to Bavaria, but here it became quietly The process was not bureaucratic. It was intimate. A village priest or caretaker would open the grave gently. Bones were cleaned by hand. Skulls were dried in sunlight, then placed onto the ossuary shelf. There was no shame in this, no secrecy. Often, a priest would bless the bones before they were moved. Families would be notified. In some cases, they came to watch. The bones were not buried again. They were brought into the light. They became part of the collective story. And here, among shelves of pale skulls and worn wooden beams, they waited, not in silence exactly, but in recognition. Many of these ossuaries remain open today. In villages like Garmisch, you can still find chapels with bone rooms attached, still kept tidy, still visited. Some have signs, others do not. Most are not on tourist maps. They're not advertised. They are simply there, known to locals, kept as part of the quiet machinery of remembrance. Walk inside one, and you may find a shelf labeled Unbekannt Unknown. These are the skulls no one claimed, or could no longer identify. They rest beside the others, equal now in anonymity, equal in form. But not all skulls are unknown. Some are lovingly labeled with names, birth years, or simple initials, scrawled in ink. Some wear traces of paint wreaths of ivy, green and faded, or a faint cross on the brow. Others are wrapped in cloth, or rest atop folded linen. A few have notes tucked beneath their jaws, remembrances, prayers, small tokens of gratitude. For those who visit, these skulls are not objects. They are continuities. Elder villagers sometimes know which row holds which relative. Grandchildren are shown, Opa Joseph or Tong Delina, with the same warmth as old photo albums. A hand is placed on the wooden shelf, a small candle lit in the corner. These acts are not public. They're not shared online. They're done quietly, because in these villages, death is not a spectacle. It is part of the rhythm, and rhythm matters here. Church bells still toll at 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m., not just for time, but for prayer. The dead are remembered in these tolls, and during Alasilin, All Souls' Day, the ossuary becomes a living space again. People gather, candles in hand. A short service may be held, but the real ritual is unspoken. Each skull receives a light. Some receive flowers. Some are gently dusted. Some are simply looked at with love. The bones do not respond, but their presence is unmistakable. And so the ossuary becomes a place of overlap where the past is not gone, only paused, where grief becomes practice, where time folds back on itself, and the living return not just to mourn, but to acknowledge. In a world that often forgets to slow down, these bone houses hold their own pace. Dusk gathers slowly. Light shifts by degrees. Names fade over decades, but structure remains. And every winter, beneath deep snow and ringing bells, the dead wait quietly beside the chapel, neither buried nor gone, but simply there. If you ask locals why the skulls are kept, they won't give you a poetic answer. They'll shrug and say, "We ran out of space. This is what we do." But behind that answer lies something deeper, a trust in cycles, a comfort in repetition, and a quiet belief that even when the world changes, the dead should still have a place where they can be seen, where they can be remembered, where their presence still matters. And maybe that's what all of us want, in the end. Not to be mourned loudly, but simply not to be moved too far away. By the time you've stood long enough inside a Bavarian ossuary, something strange happens. The room becomes less about bones and more about balance. The skulls stop feeling anonymous. The shelves begin to resemble family portraits, carefully framed by the stillness of time and the low sigh of wind through the chapel doors. Here, the dead are not distant. They are helped. There's no grandeur in these spaces, no gilded altars or soaring ceilings. The Beinhaus doesn't rise in tribute. It tucks itself beside the church like a whisper, and yet the simplicity is what gives it meaning. The space is not for performance. It is for presence. Unlike the catacombs of Paris or the extravagant bone chandeliers of Sedlik, these ossuaries do not aim to impress. They aim to continue. You'll find no poetic inscriptions here, no warnings carved into stone. No, remember, you must die etched in dramatic Latin. Instead, there is only quiet, only care, a rhythm carried forward in dust and wood and bone, and somehow, that restraint carries more power than spectacle ever could. In many ways, the Beinhaus embodies the core paradox of remembrance. How to honor the dead without turning them into symbols. How to let the bones speak without making them a museum exhibit. How to keep a person present without pretending they are still the same. The villagers never tried to answer this in words. They answered it in structure. A shelf for femurs, a row for skulls, a space for candles, lit once a year. That was enough. The tradition has not remained unchanged, of course. As Bavaria modernized, has the Catholic Church shifted toward more formal cemeteries. The practice of secondary burial slowed. Fewer ossuaries were used. Some were closed. Others turned into historical curiosities, visited mostly by outsiders. A few were sealed up, completely locked, and left to silence. But in certain places, the shelves are still tended. In small churches not far from the Austrian border, or in alpine towns where wooden chalets lean beneath the weight of snow, you can still find Beinhauser that remain part of the village's spiritual rhythm. You'll see a child glance toward the ossuary door as they leave Sunday Mass. You'll see a flower placed on a stone step, even though no one is buried there anymore. And if you speak to the elders, they may still point toward a skull and say that once she was the baker's mother. She made rye bread with aniseed, and just like that, the bones return to flesh. Memory is peculiar that way. It doesn't always need a name. Sometimes it needs only placement. A shelf, a glance, a whisper. And that is what the Beinhaus offers. A framework for remembering, built not on permanence, but on acceptance. The skull does not weep. It does not shout. It rests, held in place, carrying the faint trace of someone once deeply known. This practice may seem distant from the modern world. After all, Our cemeteries are digital now. We post photos, write tributes, archive the dead in timelines and memorial pages. But the Beinhaus offers a quieter proposition. That to be remembered doesn't require words. That to be loved doesn't require being seen every day. That to rest near those who once spoke your name, who walked the same lanes, who breathed at the same mountain, air is enough. And perhaps that is why these ossuaries continue to hold a presence so much larger than their small, wooden rooms suggest. Because they aren't about grief, or fear, or even reverence. They're about staying close. So if you find yourself someday in one of these villages, and you pass a door marked only by a simple cross, pause for a moment. Step inside. If it's open, let your eyes adjust to the low light. Let the rows of bone greet you not as artifacts, but as neighbors. And as you leave, do not say goodbye. Say, simply, you are still here, and I have seen you. Beneath the dusty streets of Palermo, Sicily, lies a gallery of the dead unlike any other in Europe. The Catacomb dei Cappuccini, the Capuchin Catacombs do not store bones behind stone or stack skulls into pyramids. They do not bleach femurs or carve chandeliers. Instead, they dress the dead in black coats, in lace, in collars and veils. They comb their hair, they cross their arms, and then they hang the muprit on the walls. Here, the dead look back. The Capuchin Catacombs began like many other monastic burial sites. Simple, underground, functional. In the 1500s, the Capuchin monks of Palermo dug a crypt beneath their monastery for their deceased brothers. They believed in simplicity, brown robes, humility, a return to dust. But when their small burial plot filled up, they exhumed a few bodies to make space. What they found surprised them. Some of the bodies were remarkably well. Rather than reburying them, they decided to display them. It wasn't vanity, it was theology. The Capuchins, like many monastic orders, believed in the constant presence of death. To see it was to remember it. To walk beside it was to remain humble. By the 1600s, the monks had created an extensive system of crypts, chambers, and passageways beneath their At first, only friars were entombed. But over time, wealthy citizens of Palermo began requesting burial there as well, not just burial, but display. To be preserved, to be dressed, to be seen. Over the next few centuries, the Capuchins mummified and displayed nearly 1,200 bodies. Some hang upright in niches along the walls. Others lie in open coffins or glass cases. Many are dressed in their finest clothes suits, dresses, religious garments, even uniforms. A few are propped into seated positions. Some wear expressions that seem almost peaceful. Others look as if they are caught mid-thought, their eyes just barely closed. It is a place where the dead do not lie flat, they stand. The methods of preservation varied. Some bodies were dried in special chambers called drying rooms, where the corpses were laid out on ceramic pipes to allow natural mummification. Others were treated with vinegar, arsenic, or various embalming fluids. The dry Sicilian climate helped, as did the monks' meticulous techniques. But preservation was only part of the process. The families of the deceased were expected to participate. They provided clothing for the dead. They visited. Some even paid for periodic maintenance. A fresh coat, a new veil, a little makeup. The bodies were not abandoned to dust. They were integrated into memory, and they were organized. The catacombs are not chaotic. They're carefully arranged by category. Monks in one hall, men in another. Women, virgins, children, professionals each, with their own section. Even clergy have a special room, their hands still folded in permanent prayer. The most famous resident is Rosalia Lombardo, a 2-year-old girl who died in 1920 and was embalmed so perfectly that she appears to be merely sleeping. Her eyelashes remain intact. Her skin retains color. Visitors often describe feeling like she might wake at any moment. Her glass coffin is tucked beneath a small altar, and candles are still lit in her memory. But Rosalia is not alone. Around her are hundreds of faces, now slack with time, staring out from behind wire mesh, or resting beneath dusted hats. They are not skeletons. They are not ghosts. They are people. Frozen. And the effect is startling, not because it is gruesome, but because it feels so near. You see shoes with laces still tied, gloves on folded hands, ties, belts, tiny buttons, all the markers of life, all gently aging beneath the rock. It's hard to know how to feel. Some visitors report awe, others discomfort. Many an odd kind of tenderness. To see the dead this way is to see how recently they were alive, how they once stood in lines, sat for portraits, how children laughed. Now, they hold space. The Capuchin Catacombs are not meant to frighten. They are meant to remind. As the monks once said, what you are, we once were. What we are, you will be. There is no mockery in that message. Only calm observation. The passage of time. The rotation of flesh into dust, and of memory into stone. But still, there is a question that hovers. If we preserve the body so carefully, what happens to the person inside it? Descending deeper into the Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo, you begin to realize that this is not a tomb in the usual sense. It is a population, a society in stillness. These are not relics buried away from sight. They are participants in a ritual of visibility, arranged by the living, kept company by the curious, and held in place by centuries of quiet consent. The dead here are not passive. They look back, their expression softened by time, altered by era framed in the folds of lace and the press of lapels. You notice how coats have grown brittle, how silk is frayed at the cuffs. In some sections, women wear corseted bodices, heads wrapped in gauze. In others, young men stand in long woolen suits, shoes placed neatly beneath them. A few tilt forward slightly, as if nodding, and yet none of it feels accidental, because even now, over 100 years since the last bodies were interred, many of the catacombs' residents are still visited. Families, generations removed, return to look, to leave flowers, to photograph. Even if the lineages have frayed, the tradition holds. Palermo remembers, and remembrance here is not quietude, it's interaction. Historically, the catacombs were a public space, not a museum, but a kind of devotional corridor. Families would visit on special days, holy days, feast days. Mothers brought children, people lit candles. The dead were touched, spoken to, even petitioned for help in the afterlife. Some were kissed on the forehead, others were wept over. What they wore mattered. It became customary to dress the dead in clothing that reflected their station or personality. A professor might be buried in his academic robes, a soldier in uniform. Children were often dressed like angels, their tiny arms folded in prayer. The clothing served as both tribute and identity, macabre way of remembering who the person was and what they meant. And over time, as fashions changed, the catacombs became a kind of visual timeline of Palermo itself. You can walk from one end to the other and witness centuries of Sicilian style. Embroidery gives way to wool, roofs vanish, replaced by crisp collars, satin buttons change to brass ones, hairstyles shift, hats come and go, corsets loosen. It is a fashion history written on the still bodies of those who wore it best. The Capuchin monks were stewards of this memory. They cleaned the catacombs, refreshed the garments when they could, and performed periodic blessings. But it was the families who maintained the connection. In some cases, they paid for upkeep. In others, they simply returned again and again, as if the presence of their loved one below the monastery still offered comfort. And it did. Because unlike a gravestone, a body preserved and dressed retained something tangible. The angle of a chin, the height of a man, the narrowness of a waist. These details whispered a person's presence, even if their voice was long gone. There's a room in the catacombs where professional men are buried. Their titles are sometimes scrawled on plaques nearby, but more often, it's their clothes that do the telling. A doctor with a polished walking stick, a judge with a black robe, a cleric with a crimson sash. All watching, or waiting, but not for resurrection, necessarily. Rather, for recognition. The Capuchin catacombs are different from other places of death, because they assume visibility. The dead are not hidden. They are not laid flat and buried deep. They are not reduced to nameplates in polished stone. They are upright, present, waiting for the gaze of the living to complete the ritual. And, as a visitor, you participate whether you intend to or not. You slow your steps. You lower your voice. You'd pause before certain faces. You wonder about their lives, what they loved, how they died, whether they chose to be here. In truth, many did. Families requested these burials. In some cases, individuals made arrangements long before their deaths, paying for preservation, selecting clothing, choosing their resting niche. To be seen after death was not morbid. It was meaningful. Because to be seen is to be remembered. The Capuchins understood this. Their famous motto, "What you are, we once were. What we are, you will be," was never meant as a threat. It was a reminder of humility, of continuity, of the shared condition of flesh and time. And it brings us back to a quiet, unsettling question. If death is certain, isn't it better to meet it standing in the clothes that once made you feel most yourself? The Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo do not grow anymore. The last official embalming fell out of fashion. Church attitudes shifted. The catacombs were no longer considered the proper place for the dead, especially in a rapidly modernizing Sicily. They remain still. And over the last 100 years, they've become something else entirely, no longer simply spiritual relics or family shrines, but pieces of Palermo's cultural memory. They are both sacred and historical, both personal and distant. They belong to families and to strangers, and this visibility is what continues to trouble and fascinate. In the 20th century, concerns began to rise about the preservation of the catacombs. The mummies were deteriorating. The dry, stable environment had slowly given way to humidity and mold. Clothing began to fall apart. Dust settled thickly. Mice, insects, and air pollution crept in. Scholars and preservationists debated what to do. To restore would be expensive and possibly unethical. To remove the bodies would violate the very essence of the catacombs' meaning. And so, in most cases, the answer was compromise. Small efforts were made. Climate control installed. Glass cases added. Signage placed to inform rather than exploit. Certain areas were closed to the public to allow for preservation. But the truth is simple. The catacombs are decaying. And somehow, that decay is not a failure. It is part of the ritual. The Capuchins never meant for the bodies to last forever. The dead were displayed to remind the living of what is coming, not to stop time, but to mark it. To show the body not as eternal, but as temporarily persistent. And now, that persistence is fading. You walk the corridors and see the soft crumble of jawbones, the gentle sag of velvet sleeves, the shifting dust of a once crisp collar. The catacombs are not dying, they're dissolving. Slowly, naturally, gracefully. Visitors still come. Tourists, historians, pilgrims, artists. They tread carefully, camera in hand, unsure whether to document or just observe. They whisper, they stare. Some pray, some cry. Some leave quickly. Most stay longer than they thought they would. Because despite the eeriness, the catacombs give something few places do. Time made visible. In our world, death is hidden. Bodies are cleaned, covered, cremated, buried under stone or in green fields. Names are carved into marble. Graves are visited briefly, then forgotten. The Capuchin Catacombs ask something else. Don't forget. Don't look away. Stand with the dead, face to face. Accept what's coming. Not with fear, but with recognition. In the end, that may be the most radical thing the monks ever did. Not the preservation. Not the mummification. Not even the display. But the belief that seeing the dead could heal the living. Because to see is to understand. To witness is to remember. And to remember is to carry forward. The Capuchin Catacombs will one day fade. The bodies will fall. The lace will crumble. The last face will collapse inward. And the dust will return to the stone. But the echo will remain. In the photographs taken. In the stories passed down. In the eyes of those who walked those halls and saw, at last, that death is not something to be managed, but something to meet. Not in terror, not in denial, but in reverence. With your coat on, your shoes tied, your head held high, and your place among the still ones already waiting. Quiet in the half-light, dressed for the end, and for everything that came before. In the quiet town of Naters, nestled in the valley beneath the snow-dusted Swiss Alps, there stands a church like many others, modest in design, pale in stone, fronted by a simple bell tower. Most who pass through the village pause to admire the view, not the church, but step inside the ossuary beneath the altar, and you'll find something quietly astonishing. Here, in this dim undercroft chapel, the dead are arranged not by status, name, or even date, but by expression. Rows of skulls stare out from wooden shelves, not behind glass, not sealed in boxes, just bone and air. But look closer, and you'll see it. A faint smile on one, a furrowed brow on another. Some skulls are serene, some seem surprised, a few look weary, and still others, though perhaps it's the light, seem almost amused. Locals call it the Knockin' Capelli. It contains over 30 rows of skulls, stacked 5 deep and 20 wide. Nearly 500 faces in total, all lined up and leaning forward, arranged in careful sympathy, not just with the space, but with each other. This ossuary, like others in the Alpine region, began out of necessity. The churchyard cemetery, used for centuries, had long since filled. As was common in medieval and early modern Europe, graves were temporary. When space ran out, older remains were respectfully exhumed and placed in a communal resting place. But in Naters, the monks added something different. Care not only for the remains, but for the personhood of the dead. They began sorting the skulls not randomly, nor alphabetically, but by perceived character. Skulls with strong jawlines, wide brows, or softer features were grouped together. Those with signs of missing teeth, healed wounds, deformations were placed nearby, as if in consolation. Skulls with symmetrical features, high cheekbones, or straight nasal bridges were given pride of position. And somewhere in the center, a cluster of especially peaceful-looking faces rests together, almost smiling in eternal repose. It sounds strange, even speculative, but this practice wasn't merely aesthetic. It was spiritual. The monks believed that the physical form reflected the soul. A kind face meant a kind life. A calm skull, a calm passing. To place these remains together was not only artistic, it was pastoral care. They believed that the dead should rest with others like themselves, that their final community should echo the harmony they had sought in life. There is little written record of who made the decisions. The sorting was likely done by monks familiar with both the theology of the body and the needs of the village. They would have known many of the dead personally. They would have recognized a face, remembered a laugh, known which skull belonged beside which, and as they worked, the monks whispered prayers. These were not anonymous bones. They were fathers, mothers, teachers, midwives, blacksmiths, people who had lived and died within the shadow of the same mountain. The ossuary reflects that. The shelves are not cold. They are wooden, oiled over centuries. Candles still burn on small ledges, their wax dripping down to the limestone floor. The walls breathe with the damp quiet of deep stone. And the skulls, though silent, seem ever-present, watching kindly, curiously, perhaps even protectively. Only peace. A small plaque at the entrance reads in Latin, Biti mortui, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. But it's the unspoken inscription that lingers. You still belong here, because that's what this chapel offers, not to a family plot, or a name carved in granite, but to a human pattern, to a space where you will not be forgotten because your face is among others like you, where your final expression is seen, understood, and gently placed alongside those who share it. It's easy to imagine a monk, long ago, holding a skull in both hands, turning it slightly in the candlelight, then nodding and saying, "Ah, you look like peace, you go here," and then placing it between two others, whose stillness would welcome it. And maybe that's all any of us want, to be seen clearly, and to be placed gently where we belong. But then you have to wonder, what would your expression say when all that remains is the shape of your smile? As you linger in the ossuary chapel beneath Naters, you begin to notice the rhythm of the skulls. It's not just their shape or placement, it's how they relate to one another. The way the shelves curve slightly with the stone. The way some skulls seem turned toward others. The way the light pools gently on smoother foreheads, while shadows deepen beneath cracked ice. It's subtle, but unmistakable. This is not storage. This is storytelling. And the story, oddly enough, is not just about death. It's about character. In a time before photography, before portraits were common among common people, this ossuary became a kind of communal portrait gallery, not painted in oils, but formed from what remained. The monks who arranged these skulls saw in them something more than medical detail. They saw the echoes of emotion, the final hints of laughter, sorrow, weariness. It may sound romanticized, but remember, the people who did this knew these faces. In a village like Naters, population was small. Everyone had names, stories, children. The monks who moved the bones had baptized them, buried their kin, shared soup on feast days. These weren't strangers. These were neighbors. The skulls bore the weight of memory, and so they were placed with care. In one section of the ossuary, a shelf seemed slightly lower than the rest. It holds a line of smaller skulls. The bones are lighter, the jaws narrower, the sockets closer set. They are not labeled, but their placement seems tender. Someone gave them a space apart, not in isolation, but in gentleness. They rest beneath a small wooden carving of a lamb. Elsewhere, a curved shelf rises above shoulder height. It holds skulls with large zygomatic arches, strong, wide jaws, thick brows, a grouping that feels deliberate, protective, as if these were once guardians of the town, or men who worked the fields. Beside them, a single skull with a missing eye socket leans ever so slightly toward the others. And yet it doesn't feel eerie. It feels familiar, as if the monks were saying, even in death, we remember who you were. It's a striking thought, especially when you consider how clinical modern memory has become. Names in spreadsheets, photos in clouds, biographies flattened into data. But Hiramung, lime-washed walls and wood-smoothed shelves, the memory of a person lives in the feel of their face. And maybe that's why visitors react the way they do. Some walk in and cry quietly, unable to explain it. Others grow contemplative, tracing a finger along the candle shelf, as if greeting old friends. A few smile softly, as if reassured that death does not have to strip away personality, that bone can still bear kindness. Of course, science tells us that expression does not linger in the skull, that smiles come from muscle, that frowns fade with tissue. But the monks believed something else, that the soul's final state left a trace, that a peaceful death made for a peaceful skull. And maybe they were right. Or maybe they just needed to believe it, to cope with so much loss, so much turnover, so many graves emptied, bodies moved, names forgotten. Maybe the organization was less about theology and more about continuity, a quiet insistence that even when we're reduced to bone, we're not reduced to nothing, because someone still looks at us and sees something. In that way, the ossuary becomes a kind of mirror. You'll look into rows of empty eyes, and they reflect your own fears back to you, not cruelly, but calmly. You think, how would I be remembered? Would I look peaceful? Would someone know where to place me? And behind that, an even quieter question. Would anyone care to try? It is easy to think of death as disappearance, but places like this suggest otherwise. They'd say, you may be silent, but not forgotten. Still, present, part of a pattern. It's worth noting that some skulls are darker than others, tinted by age, soot, oils from hands that touch them too often. A few have been gently polished by time, their foreheads faintly shiny. These are the skulls people seem drawn to. Not the most complete, not the most beautiful, but the most human. And in this, the arrangement becomes a kind of comfort. Because even if your story is forgotten, even if no one speaks your name again, even if your bones are moved and sorted and placed in a row, you still might sit beside a smile. The ossuary beneath Natures has no grand entrance, no ticket booth, no guide, just a wooden door tucked behind the church, where a small plaque Z to misreads simply but inside, the quiet is thick enough to press against your skin. The air is still. The candles, if lit, flicker low and steady, and the skulls wait. What began as a space-saving solution slowly became something else. Not a charnel house, not a museum, but a place of emotional architecture, a chapel of empathy. Because, over the years, as the village buried and exhumed, prayed and remembered, a kind of language emerged, not spoken, but shaped in bone. There is no record of how many times the skulls were moved, no master plan or diagram, and yet, the final arrangement feels deliberate, almost inevitable. A curve here, a tilt there, each cranium placed not just where there was room, but where it made sense. Not logically, emotionally. Some shelves lean slightly, worn by the weight of years. In winter, frost gathers lightly on the outer wall. In spring, moisture seeps in through ancient mortar, and the scent of stone and wood thickens the air. The bones do not complain. They adapt, they endure. It is that endurance that speaks loudest, because the truth is, this ossuary is not meant to last forever. The monks who arranged it have long since passed. The villagers who remembered the faces have grown old, then older still. A few families remain, ones who still light candles, still trace names, but much of the intimacy has faded into quiet reverence. And still, the skulls rest, not because they are historical artifacts, but because they are part of the landscape. Just as the mountains do not demand your row, the ossuary does not demand your tears. It simply is a presence, a persistence, a reminder that belonging isn't about fame or legacy, it's about placement. And for the monks of Natures, placing a skull was an act of care. To hold it in both hands, to recognize the tilt of a jaw, the width of the ice, to remember, perhaps, a joke once told, a field once hopped, and to say, in the simplest, kindest way, you go here. That might sound small, but in the end, it is everything. Because when we imagine our own deaths, we often think of separation, of being gone, unreachable, sealed away in earth or fire. But the Bindhouse of Natures offers another vision. That even when our names are lost, our presence can remain. That our final place in the world can be chosen with tenderness. And that someone, somewhere, might still find comfort in the pattern we leave behind. So the skulls stay. Some with cracks, some without teeth, some with moss growing faintly along the crown. But all still resting, all still placed, all still seen. And when you step back from the final shelf, your eyes adjusting to the candlelight, your breath slow with reverence, you might find yourself feeling less afraid. Not because death is far away, but because it's near, and quiet, and calm, and possibly not as lonely as you feared. Because even when all that's left is bone, someone might still know where to put you, and someone might still say, "Welcome back, you belong here." So now, as the candlelight flickers lower, and the final echoes settle in the stillness around you, allow yourself to drift from these quiet corridors of history. The ossuaries, the catacombs, the shelves of bone and memory. Do not ask for fear, only for reflection. The monks who gathered skulls were not trying to frighten anyone. They were offering something steady, something grounded, a way to make peace with the inevitable, to bring shape and care to the great silence that waits for us all. Imagine, if you will, the hush of a stone chapel at dusk, a faint scent of old wood, candle wax, and earth. Outside, snow begins to fall in the darkened village square. Inside, rows of skulls rest not in terror, but in calm, 1,000 stories told in stillness, lined side by side like old friends long since gone to sleep. There's nothing more to see, nothing more to fear, just the rhythm of breath, the soft pull of gravity, the slow return to rest. Let this be enough for now. You are safe, you are seen, you are part of the same pattern. Bones may crumble, names may fade, but presence lingers, so exhale gently. Release the weight of the day, and if your thoughts begin to drift, let them go where they may, toward winding corridors, flickering candles, gentle stone, and that final, patient stillness. You're not alone in the dark. You're simply part of the quiet now. And with that, let's close our eyes, soften the breath, and let history keep watch as we sleep.